Well, the tiny mountainous country of Switzerland has been in a state of perpetual neutrality since the major European powers of the time declared it so during the Congress of Vienna after the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815. So, why did these countries do this? Okay, so the French conquered Switzerland in 1798 and established the Helvetic Republic. This was in an attempt to make Switzerland something of a strategically positioned French satellite state. Well, not long after that, the Austrian and French forces invaded the country in their war against France. The Swiss, rather than fighting alongside their French overlords, largely refused to. This ultimately led to the Act of Mediation, giving the Swiss back much of their former independence. 12 years later, they got the rest back thanks to that aforementioned Congress of Vienna, in which their neutrality in the wars of their neighbors was officially recognized. Beyond the Swiss themselves having long tried to stay out of the conflicts of Europe since the early 16th century after a devastating loss at the Battle of Marignano, part of the reason Switzerland was granted neutrality in perpetuity in 1815 is because the European powers of the time deemed that the country was ideally located to function as a valuable buffer zone between France and Austria. Thus, granting their neutrality in wars, so long as they continued to stay out of them, would contribute to stability in the region. Since that time, with a few minor exceptions, Switzerland has steadfastly refused to compromise its neutrality for any reason, though on the war front they did suffer an exceptionally brief civil war in the mid-19th century, resulting in only a handful of casualties. While minor in its scale, this civil war actually drastically changed the political landscape of the Swiss government, including the establishment of a constitution partially borrowing from the less than a century old United States Constitution. In any event, as for those aforementioned minor exceptions, Switzerland has occasionally taken part in some global peacekeeping missions, and prior to 1860, Swiss troops did sometimes take part in various skirmishes despite their neutrality. In more modern times, Switzerland needed to defend its borders from both Allied and Axis air incursions during World War II. For instance, they shot down nearly a dozen German planes in the spring of 1940 alone, as well as shot down some American bombers and forced down countless others on both sides. This included grounding and detaining the crews of over 100 Allied bombers that had tried to fly over the country. When Hitler tried to counter Swiss measures at keeping the Luftwaffe from their skies by sending a sabotage team to destroy Swiss airfields, the Swiss successfully captured the saboteurs before they could carry out any bombings. You might think it a bit silly for the Swiss to risk war with both sides by shooting down or forcing down foreign aircraft from their skies, but on several occasions Allied bombers accidentally attacked Swiss cities, mistaking them for German ones. For instance, on April 1st, 1944, this very thing happened and it killed 40 Swiss citizens and destroyed over 50 buildings. This was not an isolated incident. So how exactly did Switzerland, surrounded on all sides by Axis and Allied powers during the war to end all wars, manage to keep enemy troops at bay without much in the way of any fighting? So officially, Switzerland maintains a policy of aggressive neutrality. This means that while it avoids taking part in any conflicts, as evidenced by their Air Force activities during World War II, it will defend its own interests with vigor. So how vigorously? Well, to ensure other countries respect its neutral stance, Switzerland has long put itself into a terrifyingly overprepared position to fight. It's also made sure that every country around them is well aware of this. As for specifics, well, to begin with, a common misconception about Switzerland is that because it doesn't actively take part in global military conflicts, that it doesn't have a strong or well-prepared military. The reality is the Swiss military is a highly trained and competent fighting force, and due to the country's policy of compulsory conscription of males — today women may volunteer for any position in the military but are not required to serve — it is surprisingly large for a country of only 8 million people. In fact, approximately 2/3 of all males are ultimately deemed mentally and physically fit enough to serve in the Swiss military. This means that a huge percentage of their population is trained. Those who are not and aren't exempt because of a disability are required to pay additional taxes until they are 30 to make up for not serving. As for what fighting force is actively maintained, the Swiss military today is only around 140,000 men strong, and just recently it has been voted to reduce that to 100,000. This is a major downsize from just 2 decades ago, when it was estimated the Swiss military had some 750,000 soldiers. For reference, this latter total is about half the size of the United States military today, despite Switzerland only having 8 million people versus the United States' 300 million. Further, Switzerland has one of the highest rates of gun ownership in the world, and many Swiss people are highly competent in handling firearms due to both compulsory military service and a strong culture of recreational shooting. 500,000 Swiss children are said to be a part of a gun club of some kind. That said, in recent years, the rate of gun ownership has declined somewhat after a series of gun-related incidents, such as one where a man shot his estranged wife with his old military-issued rifle. Prior to that shooting, military conscripts would take home their rifle after their service period ended and were expected to keep it ready for use in defending the country should the need arise. After these incidents, the military curbed this and implemented a new policy stating that any conscript wishing to keep their gun after service must buy it and apply for a permit. As part of this new policy, the Swiss military also no longer provides ammunition with the guns, instead keeping it in secure locations that citizens must get to in the event of an emergency. And speaking of emergencies, generally speaking, Switzerland is prepared for nearly any global catastrophe, whether that's nuclear fallout or a surprise invasion. This is because of a defensive plan that they've had in place since 1880. This defensive plan was also doubled down upon in World War II and later during the Cold War. Dubbed the Swiss National Redoubt, Switzerland has taken advantage of its unique natural geography, which includes mountains that surround it on nearly all sides, to build countless bunkers, fortifications, and warehouses across the country that can be accessed at a moment's notice. The full scale of the fortifications is a closely guarded secret, but some of them are kept in plain view as part of a comprehensive campaign of deterrence. Initially, the National Redoubt consisted of tunnels bored into the many mountains of Switzerland in key strategic positions for retreating troops and citizens to take shelter in, but over the years these have evolved to encompass a host of ingenious defensive and offensive structures. Along with tunnels and bunkers, which are fully stocked and contain everything from bakeries and hospitals to dormitories, the mountains of Switzerland also hide countless tanks, aircraft, and hidden artillery guns, some of which are pointed directly at Switzerland's own roads to destroy them in the event of an invasion. Oddly, for a landlocked country, Switzerland does maintain an active navy of sorts, though they don't store any boats in its mountains, as far as we could find. The naval branch of the Swiss forces' primary role is patrolling the country's lakes on the border and providing aid in search and rescue operations. Okay, so as for more specifically how they kept themselves out of the world wars, during World War I, the Swiss military, under freshly appointed General Ulrich Willow, mobilized well over 200,000 Swiss soldiers and deployed them across its major entry points to deter any outside forces from considering waging war on the country. After it became apparent that Switzerland's neutrality would be recognized by all powers in the First Great War, the vast majority of the Swiss troops were sent home. In fact, in the final year of the war, the Swiss military had shrunk its numbers to just 12,000. Simply, nothing further was required to keep the Swiss out of World War I. World War II was a different beast altogether, with Switzerland not banking on Hitler respecting their long-held neutral stance in European conflicts. Thus, newly appointed Swiss General Henri Guisan was given the unenviable task of trying to figure out a way to defend the small country from their neighbors, Hitler and his allies, despite the fact said powers drastically outmatched the Swiss army in a variety of ways. Towards this end, leading up to the war, the Swiss withdrew from the League of Nations to help ensure their neutrality and began to rebuild their military, bringing the number up to 430,000 combat troops within 3 days of the start of the war. They also strongly encouraged their citizens to keep at minimum 2 months' worth of supplies on hand at any given time. On top of that, they also began secret negotiations with France to join forces against Germany should Germany attack Switzerland, which was a risky move that was discovered by the Germans after France fell to them. But even with all that, knowing the Swiss couldn't win if Hitler really wanted to invade, Guisan and co. made the decision to drastically ramp up their World War I era strategy of making invading Switzerland as unsavory an option as possible. Guisan noted that by utilizing Switzerland's harsh terrain, a comparatively small amount of Swiss soldiers in a secure defensive position could fight off a massive fighting force if the need ever arose. So the plan was essentially to perpetually defend and retreat to some fortified position over and over again, ultimately conceding the less defensible populated areas of the country once the government and citizens had managed a retreat into secret fortified positions in the Alps. They would then use the Alps as a base from which to launch guerrilla attacks to make life as miserable as possible for any successful invasion force. More controversially, Switzerland continued to trade with Nazi Germany during the war in order to further disincentivize Hitler from invading. There is some speculation that some of the Allies' claimed accidental attacks on Switzerland were really not accidents at all, given that some of the buildings that were blown up were factories supplying the Axis powers. Well, this multi-pronged plan, it totally worked, and while Hitler did have a detailed plan in place of how to invade Switzerland, the cost of doing so was always too high given the problems that the Axis powers were having on both the eastern and western fronts. Thus, Switzerland was largely ignored by both Allies and the Axis powers during World War II, despite its amazingly well-placed location right next to Germany, Italy, France, and Austria. Switzerland stepped up their level of defense during the Cold War, again mostly out of a desire to deter any potential invaders. This time, however, the focus was on aggressively defending Switzerland's borders instead of defending them only long enough to cover a retreat into the well-fortified mountains. Towards this end, Switzerland's roads, bridges, and train lines were rigged with explosives that could be detonated at any time. In many cases, the engineers who designed the bridges were required to come up with the most efficient way using explosives to ensure the complete destruction of those same bridges. Once the destruction plan was developed, hidden explosives were installed at the appropriate locations on the bridges. On top of that, the military also lined hundreds of mountains flanking major roads with explosives in order to create artificial rock slides. All total, over 3,000 points of demolition are publicly known to have been implemented throughout the small country. With ground attacks covered, the Swiss, they look to the skies. Unfortunately for them, attack by air is much harder to defend against for a country so small that enemy air forces could penetrate anywhere within its borders before an adequate defense could be mustered to defend its cities. To protect against this, the Swiss government constructed thousands of bomb shelters in homes, towns, and cities to such a degree that it's estimated that anywhere between 80 to 120% of the country's population could hide in them for extended periods. Many of these shelters also included small hospitals and the necessary equipment to set up independent command centers. In fact, homes built after World War II were often made with over 40 centimeter, that's 16-inch thick concrete ceilings to help them survive aerial bombings. If your home didn't accommodate such a shelter, you had to pay a tax to support the places that did. It's also rumored that much of Switzerland's gold supply, as well as vast supplies of food stores, have been similarly squirreled away somewhere in the Alps, which comprise just over half of the country's total land area. As a further example of just how ridiculously well prepared the Swiss are for any and all threats, there are things like hidden hydroelectric dams built inside of unmarked mountains, so that in the event of mass bombings, they'd still have electricity from these secret facilities. And remember, these are the things the Swiss government lets the general public know about. It's thought that there are probably more fortifications and hidden goodies scattered throughout the country's landscape. Since the end of the Cold War, similar to how the Swiss government has been slowly disarming its population and reducing its standing army, decommissioning some of these fortifications has begun in order to reduce government spending. The Swiss government is somewhat coy about the extent of this disarming, but it has been reported that many of the more extreme defenses, such as the explosives that used to be hidden inside the country's bridges and along its road and railways, have been removed. As for the bunkers, unfortunately, simply abandoning many of these facilities is not an option, and it's fairly expensive to decommission them. As such, as the head of security policy for the Federal Department of Defense, Christian Katrina, said, "In most cases, we'd be glad if someone would take them off our hands for no price." In some cases, this has resulted in companies using the ridiculously well-protected and secure mountain facilities as data repositories and server farms. In one such converted bunker, the servers inside are even completely protected from outside electromagnetic impulses that might result from nuclear explosions. In another, detailed instructions on how to build devices for reading all known data storage formats, even older formats like floppy disks, are kept so that if that knowledge is otherwise lost, future generations can still decode our data storage devices to access the data within correctly. Essentially, the researchers involved in this particular project have attempted to create a Rosetta Stone of data formats and are using a ridiculously secure Swiss bunker as the storage point for that knowledge. As a result of military downsizing, the fate of the rest of the fortifications is unclear, and there are calls to decommission all of them, despite the estimated billion-dollar price tag of doing so. There is even a growing minority of the Swiss population who would like to see the entire military disbanded, including ceasing military conscription. But for now, at least, any country that wishes to ignore Switzerland's long-held neutrality in military conflicts will find the tiny country an exceptionally difficult one to conquer and occupy. And presumably, if war ever again threatens Switzerland's borders, regardless of how small they make their military today, they'll likely keep themselves in a position to rapidly ramp back up their defenses, as they did for both World War I and World War II. Shortly before World War II, Switzerland passed the Swiss Banking Act, which allowed bank accounts to be created anonymously. This was in no small part to allow German Jews to hide their assets from the Third Reich. And now for another bonus fact. The term Swiss Army knife was coined by United States soldiers after World War II. The soldiers had trouble pronouncing the original name of the device, which I'm not going to try and pronounce, but it stands for Swiss Officer's Knife, and thus began calling the multi-tool a Swiss Army knife. The company that makes Swiss Army knives is Victorinox, named after the founder Karl Elsner's deceased mother, Victoria. The Nox part comes from the fact that stainless steel is also known as inox, which is short for the French term inoxidable. Karl Elsner himself was originally the owner of a surgical equipment company. He later took over production of the original Model 1890 knives, which were previously made in Germany. He moved the production to Switzerland and greatly improved the design of the original multi-tool. His big breakthrough came when he worked out a way to put blades on both sides of the handle using the same spring to hold both sides in place. This allowed him to put twice as many features into the multi-tool as was previously possible. And now for another bonus fact. On average, more people commit crimes in Switzerland who aren't Swiss citizens than who are every year, which has very recently led to harsher deportation laws. In fact, of the top 25 nationalities to commit crimes in Switzerland, 21 of them commit more crimes than the Swiss while on Swiss soil. Indeed, on average, immigrants are more than 390% more likely to commit crime than Swiss citizens.
In the first 2 years of World War II, the German armed forces, or Wehrmacht, and especially the army, or Heer, stunned the world with an unprecedented string of victories against several otherwise prominent nations that it boggles the mind the one small nation could so easily conquer, let alone so rapidly. From September 1939 to December 1941, German troops occupied Poland, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, France, Yugoslavia, and Greece. They also ejected the British Expeditionary Force from continental Europe, sank countless Allied convoys in the Atlantic, and alongside Italy and other Axis powers collected further victories in Northern Africa and the Soviet Union. So what made the Wehrmacht so effective against so many other nations' armies that on the surface should have been able to repel them? It's tempting to reply with a single all-encompassing answer. It was because German soldiers were indoctrinated fanatics. It was down to superior German technology. The Germans won because they got as high as Stuckers on meth, and another favourite go-to answer for the keyboard generals, because blitzkrieg tactics. But as you'll no doubt guess from the length of today's video, contrary to popular belief, it's not really so simple as that, and there was a lot more that went into it. To briefly address the first of the often put forth answers, the use of methamphetamine was introduced amongst both Axis and Allied soldiers as a means to combat fatigue and heighten morale. However, German officers realized early on that the negative side effects of the drug far outweighed its benefits and discouraged its use. Moving on to blitzkrieg, or lightning war, this has been described alternatively as a strategy, a tactical mindset, or a doctrine. But in reality, the German military despised the term, which was used by press and propaganda to describe the effects of a successful combined arms offensive. Now, to be fair, the German approach to combined arms operations, although never described as blitzkrieg, played an important role in securing military successes, but they were not the single deciding factor. To the surprise of absolutely no one, I hope, once again, the early victories of the Third Reich were a combination of several factors, many of which had been at play since the early 1920s. So let's dive in, shall we? To begin with, let's discuss the interwar rearmament. At the end of World War I, the victorious Entente imposed a substantial disarmament on the Weimar Republic, the successor state to the Second German Reich. Article 160 of the Treaty of Versailles limited the Reichswehr to a land army of 100,000 soldiers with no general staff, no air force, no tanks, and a small navy. In essence, Germany was allowed to maintain a military devoted exclusively to preserving order within its territory and patrolling the borders. These restrictions were to be enforced by the Inter-Allied Military Control Commission, which maintained a presence in Germany until 1927. With such a heavy disadvantage, how could Germany rebuild its forces and become such a military threat in the 1930s? Well, the truth is, the Weimar Republic circumvented these limitations from the early 1920s. First of all, they kept their general staff, although it was rebranded as Truppenamt, or Troop Office. As early as May 1923, this office drafted secret plans to mobilize an army larger than the Versailles-imposed restrictions. The document, captured at the end of World War II, showed that these early plans envisioned two options: the creation of a force of either 18 or 35 infantry divisions. While the chance to equip the second option was admittedly slim, the Reichswehr appeared confident that they could outfit the first option. Considering a division strength of at least 14,000 men, the Reichswehr packed enough guns and ammo to field an army of up to 252,000 troops, more than double the size permitted by the Versailles Treaty. In fact, the German government had access to large secret stashes of weapons, either maintained in secret from the World War I arsenals or imported illegally. Moreover, throughout the 1920s, large numbers of men underwent unauthorized military training by joining one of dozens of paramilitary units, politically motivated militias, or sporting associations. Notable examples include the SA, the brown shirts employed by the Nazi Party, or their communist equivalent, the Red Front Fighters League. In 1926, the mobilization plan was toned down to 16 divisions, but in 1932, War Minister General von Schleicher created a new plan designed to fully equip 21 divisions by 1938. In 1933, when Adolf Hitler first became Chancellor and then Führer, he ordered to accelerate Schleicher's mobilization plans. These were carried out in secret in the span of 18 months. However, these troops were badly equipped and poorly trained. 2 years later, in March of 1935, Hitler further ordered for the standing army to be ramped up to 36 divisions. To compensate for the additional efforts, German military expenditure doubled in 1933 to 1935 from 3 to 6% of gross national product. This rate of expenditure would continue to grow, reaching 23% in 1939 and peaking at an astounding 61% in 1943. Now, we have mentioned that the troop office could rely on a pool of men who had already received basic training, albeit privately, from their political party of choice. And these men could surely hold their own in a fistfight or when handling small arms such as rifles and machine guns, but how about developing competence with tanks, airplanes, and submarines? That was a no-no, according to the Inter-Allied Commission. But the troop office had an answer to that. Going back a bit, in February of 1919, Weimar authorities arrested a Russian national, Karl Radek, due to his involvement in the Spartacist Revolution, a communist uprising. Thanks to his contacts with Germany's military attaché to Moscow, Radek avoided a harsh prison sentence. He was even able to hold a political salon in August of 1919, in which he first suggested a political and military collaboration between the Weimar Republic and Soviet Russia. The idea was further expanded following the Russian defeat of the Russo-Polish War of 1920, its main driver being German General Hans von Seeckt. And so it was that in early 1921, the Troop Office established Special Group R, devoted to collaboration with Russia. Germany was to offer financial and technical aid to build Russia's armament industry. In exchange, Berlin would receive artillery ammunition, which it was forbidden from manufacturing by the Versailles Treaty. The two powers concluded an economic treaty on April 16, 1922, the Treaty of Rapallo, which was rumored to contain secret military clauses. This was just unsubstantiated rumor, but it captured the cloak and dagger nature of the military negotiations, conducted mostly behind the back of the German Minister of Foreign Affairs. In any event, from February to August of 1923, the chief of the Troop Office, General Otto Haas, conducted secret talks with Moscow, in which the two parties discussed a defensive alliance against Poland and its ally France. The most tangible outcome of the talks was the establishment of a special Group R detachment in Moscow, the Zentral Moscow, or ZMO for short. In 1924, the ZMO founded 3 secret schools to test and train troops on weapon systems forbidden by Versailles. These were located in Lipetsk, Kazan, and Staratov. They were dedicated to aircraft, tanks, and gas warfare, respectively. These secret plans, however, did not escape the watchful eye of French and Polish intelligence, and news leaked to Britain. In December of 1926, the Manchester Guardian blew open the affair, embarrassing the Weimar government. But even officials initially opposed the dealings with Russia begrudgingly admitted to the importance of this friendship in rebuilding the German military. What followed was a token reaction from the Weimar government to reassure the world that they were all about peaceful coexistence. First, they discontinued the import of Soviet ordnance by early 1927, but we should probably also mention military-industrial cooperation resumed the following year. As for the 3 schools, they were handed over to private enterprises which continued to train off-duty German officers as private individuals. In other words, it was totally fine for a reserve officer to catch a train to Kazan and play around with tanks for a couple of weeks. The schools founded by the Zentral Moscow continued their operations until 1933, providing a solid base for the future development of German combined armor and aircraft tactics. With the rise to power of the Nazi Party, however, the ideology gap between Germany and the Soviet Union became too large, and the training stations were closed by September 1933. A similar scheme had been put in place to develop the capabilities of the Kriegsmarine, or Navy. In this one, in 1922, a consortium of 3 German shipyards founded a new company headquartered in The Hague in the Netherlands. This company's innocent-sounding name was Engineering Office for Shipbuilding, or IVS in its German acronym. The not-so-innocent purpose of the IVS was to build and test U-boats in Dutch shipyards. 3 years later, in 1925, the Naval Ministry poured funds into IVS when Turkey placed an order for 2 U-boats. These vessels needed to be tested, so Navy officers Admiral Spindler and Corvette Captain Canaris created a training office within the ministry. Worthy of note here, Canaris would later rise to the rank of admiral and become the head of the Abwehr, Nazi Germany's military intelligence service. In that capacity, Canaris actually undermined Hitler's plans for conquest and the extermination of undesirables via sending secret military plans to the Allies and actively protecting certain Jews from arrest. But more on all this in a bit, and how the Allies really messed up with regards to all of this. Back to the mid-1920s now. Spindler assigned 2 retired naval officers to set up a U-boat training school in conjunction with the Turkish Navy. This was the start of another secret training program, albeit less developed than the schemes founded by the Zentrum Moscow. Specifically, in 1927, Spindler established a torpedo and radio school in Flensburg, northern Germany, where 24 young officers received theoretical lectures delivered mostly via films shot during World War I. By now, you should have noticed a recurring theme emerging: a massive amount of training. A thorough preparation of fighting personnel had always been a staple of first Prussian and then German military life. When the Nazi Party assumed power, this became even more important and something they were extremely successful at. As American military analysts Trevor Dupuy and Martin van Creveld, in a study of both Allied and German troops facing each other after the D-Day landings of June 6, 1944, noted, on a man-for-man basis, German ground soldiers consistently inflicted casualties at about a 50% higher rate than they incurred from the opposing British and American troops under all circumstances. This was true when they were attacking and when they were defending, when they had a local numerical superiority, and when, as was usually the case, they were outnumbered, when they had air superiority and when they did not, when they won and when they lost. Another analyst, W. Victor Madej, writing for the Journal of Political and Military Sociology in 1978, noted how Allied propaganda and popular culture had perpetrated the idea that German early military success and later perseverance could be traced back to fanaticism fueled by propaganda and indoctrination. This idea was itself rooted in the belief that totalitarian states could somehow instill their forces with an almost supernaturally high morale and willingness to fight. But Madej quoted a study conducted by Edward Shills and Morris Janowitz of the Allied Psychological Warfare Division, which revealed that German troops' morale and willingness to fight had little to do with political belief and mostly derived from group cohesion at small unit level. Madej partially accepted this view, but preferred another conclusion. The Wehrmacht's effectiveness derived very simply from military professionalism and the proper use of weaponry. In other words, German soldiers were extremely effective soldiers not so much from fanaticism, but because they were extremely well trained. You may remember that Hitler's government doubled military expenditure from 1933 to 1935. That is when intensive troop training really kicked in. But the arms budget did not yet allow the German coffers to equip all units with the best and latest military technology. Hitler's general staff therefore decided to concentrate their efforts on a small number of selected units, which would be used as a spearhead for offensive operations. So let's now take a look at these training regiments. Rank-and-file soldiers, usually conscripts, were initially subjected to 16 weeks of basic drills consisting of physical fitness and fire and maneuver techniques. These were followed by a further 3 months of schooling in armor artillery or other specialized branches. Training from sunrise until dark, recruits underwent lengthy force marches, live fire exercises, and conditioning exercises, which caused high rates of injuries and exhaustion. Soldiers also became familiar with the grooming and handling of horses. This was an absolute necessity. Despite the propagandist image of a hare speeding through Europe atop trucks, tanks, and motorcycles, the reality was that less than 20% of German infantry was actually motorized at the time. Further, career soldiers who had previously served in the Weimar Republic's Reichswehr, or foot soldiers with potential, were selected to join the non-commissioned officer ranks, the backbone of the Heer. In this case, candidates completed 4 months of basic instruction, followed by 6 months of specialization. As you might expect, training for commissioned officers was even lengthier and more intense. Candidates first had to go through the same course as a non-commissioned officer, totaling 10 months. Then they were assigned to an already serving unit for a period of 7 months. During this period, they developed affiliation and cohesion with existing units and honed their leadership skills. Finally, candidates completed 3 months of advanced specialization with an infantry, armor, artillery, or support branch. Throughout the training, would-be officers learned how to lead from the front, a concept which heightened morale and stressed the importance of independent tactical decisions, provided they served a pre-assigned operational goal. This approach proved incredibly effective as officers learned how to exploit enemy weaknesses on the spot and often take brilliant initiatives. The flip side was the high death rate among the leadership ranks in the first 3 years of World War II, with more than 16,000 German officers dying in action. Moving on to the service branches, their training was likewise top-notch. Candidate pilots joining the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, first completed a 6-month spell of basic drills. Then they spent 2 months studying general aeronautical topics before moving to flying school. The first step was to learn how to pilot light aircraft, a course which included aerodynamics, engineering, navigation, meteorology, and communications. Upon completion, candidates learned how to fly heavier, high-performance craft, which awarded them a B flying license. Next, trainees split into 2 separate specialty courses, one for single-engine fighters and dive bombers, and one for twin-engine fighters, bombers, and reconnaissance craft. By the time a fighter or dive bomber pilot had completed his course, he would have received about 13 months of training, totaling 150 to 200 flying hours. A bomber or reconnaissance pilot had undergone 20 months in school with 220 to 270 flying hours. The longest training period, however, was the one reserved for naval officers. Recruits started out their tenure with 10 weeks of basic drilling, followed by 3 months at sea. Only those selected by instructing officers were given the rank of cadet and allowed to move to the next stage, 10 more months of life at sea, serving as an ordinary sailor. After another examination, cadets were promoted to midshipmen, and only then they got access to naval officer school, which lasted 2 years. And it didn't end there. Graduates were given a non-commissioned rank, warrant officer, and were finally promoted to officer only upon selection by their ship's commander. So that covers the manpower and the extensive training the soldiers spearheading the initial attack had previously received. But soldiers, sailors, and pilots need kit, which required Hitler to ramp up German rearmament programs. On this one, besides what's already been discussed, in 1933, German military aircraft production totaled to a nice round figure of 0, but by 1934 it had risen to 840 units. The following year, production more than doubled and continued to expand at an average of 2,654 per year. By 1939, German industries had produced a total of 15,927 single and twin-engine planes, of which approximately 2,000 were operational at the start of the war. The production of tanks and self-propelled guns followed a similar curve, soaring from 0 to a total of 3,502 in 1939, of which 2,200 units were fully operational. As for the Kriegsmarine, in 1933 they could boast only 5 capital ships and 22 destroyers. By 1939, this fleet had expanded to 53 surface vessels and 63 U-boats. This rearmament, by the way, was a violation of the Anglo-German naval agreements of 1935 and 1937, which limited the German fleet total tonnage to 35% that of the Royal Navy. Clearly, developing such an arsenal required tons of cash, yet the German economy had been badly hit, first by the aftermath of the Great War, then by hyperinflation in the 1920s, and finally by the Great Depression. So, how on earth could the Nazis afford such an ambitious rearmament program? Well, they couldn't, yet they did. So, what's going on here? Well, they had their finance minister and former president of the Reichsbank's Hjalmar Schacht to thank for that. He created a dummy corporation, the Metallurgical Research Institute, which issued bills of exchange known as MIFO bills. The government then used these MIFOs, which were essentially IOUs, to pay military and heavy industry contractors, thus funding rearmament projects. Contractors could exchange the MIFOs against regular currency after a period of 90 days, but most firms were happy to hold on to them as they carried an interest rate of 4%, higher than other trade bills at the time. And even if they did want to cash them in, Schlatt continuously extended the maturation period, which eventually peaked at 5 years. We could describe the MIFO system using a quote from the Nuremberg trials: a swindling venture on a national scale that has no precedent. Nonetheless, it did the trick. From 1934 to 1938, the Nazis funded their rearmament with 12 billion Reichsmarks worth of MIFO bills, or adjusting for inflation, about $104 billion in 2023. Schlacht further motivated private contractors to invest in military production by capping taxation on their dividends as well as freezing the wages of their workers. All in all, these measures stimulated the German economy and reduced unemployment to virtually zero. Military contractors were very happy to maximize their profits. German workers were very happy too to have a job, at least initially. They were all less pleased in the late 1930s when they realized all salary increases and promotions had been put on hold, and any dissent was preemptively quelled by laws prohibiting industrial action and reallocation to forced labor details. Of course, the long-term effect of this was a reduction in productivity of factory workers, which would lead to drops in efficiency and quality in the latter half of the war. But in any event, in addition to issuing monopoly money to pay for risk tanks, the Nazi government had another source of funding at their disposal: the reoccupation of demilitarized German territories in and the annexation of bordering countries. The German regions of the Saarland and Rhineland bordering France and Benelux had been demilitarized. In addition to that, Saarland was also subjected to French formal administration. In January 1935, a referendum returned the Saar to Germany, a great win for the economy as the area was rich in coal, vital for the arms industry. Next, on March 7, 1936, 20,000 troops moved into the Rhinelands in flagrant violation of Versailles. Not only did this area make for the perfect staging ground for an offensive into the Benelux countries and France, but it was also rich in coal and iron. The action also served as a test to gauge the resolve of Britain and France against German resurgence. The Western Allies, enacting a policy of appeasement, did nothing. Emboldened by this lack of resolve, Hitler continued to absorb territories in 1938 and 1939. Notably, on March 13, 1938, the Anschluss took place, the annexation of Austria. It may have involved some forceful coercion on the part of Austrian Nazis, certainly, but Berlin had seized an entire country without the Wehrmacht firing a single shot, which made for a fantastic return on investment for the rearmament effort. Germany had, in fact, now gained control of iron ore mines of the Ennstall Alps, as well as Austria's cash reserves, equivalent to 782 million Reichsmarks. The next victim of what was essentially a large-scale home invasion was Czechoslovakia. With the pretext of protecting German-speaking minorities, the Nazis successfully annexed the border Sudetenland region in October of 1938. This is, of course, a very complex affair known as the Munich Crisis. What matters to us today is that Britain and France essentially allowed the occupation of the Sudetenland by Germany, despite Czechoslovakia's pleas, in order to avoid a war. Notably here, the annexation of Czech territories allowed Germany to seize control of the Škoda manufacturing works and their supply networks. Škoda is known today as a manufacturer of reasonably priced cars for suburban families, but back then it was known as a leading manufacturer of tanks. The acquisition of Škoda allowed the army to accelerate their armor program, increasing the quantity and quality of tank production. So let's stop for a moment and focus on a character we already met, naval officer Wilhelm Canaris. By 1938, he was already head of the military intelligence service, the Abwehr, with the rank of admiral. Despite his position, Admiral Canaris secretly despised the Nazis and was concerned about the increasingly bellicose plans of the party leadership. Canaris and his deputy Colonel Hans Oster, however, knew that not everybody in the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, or OKW, was aligned to Hitler's plans of conquest. It was no secret that the Führer intended to expand in the east, and that would entail going to war with France and Britain, a daunting prospect for a professional, rationally minded officer. Thus, as the Munich crisis unfolded, Hans Oster and his agents desperately attempted to communicate with British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, advising to oppose the land grab in the Sudetenland. Oster's message essentially was this: if Hitler fails, his generals will turn against him. If he succeeds, they will continue to go along with him. Unfortunately, Chamberlain ignored the advice, preferring to stick to his policy of appeasement. It wouldn't be the last time that the West would ignore Oster's warnings. In any event, as it turns out, the border regions of Czechoslovakia were not enough for Hitler. Following a gradual dissolution of the country and the independence of Slovakia, German troops took control of Bohemia and Moravia in March of 1939. Once again, the move was economically motivated. The aggressive rearmament plan had already exhausted Germany and Austria's currency reserves, and Prague's central bank's gold stashes made for a much-needed cash injection. So to recap, we have covered how the Weimar Republic first and then the Third Reich gradually rebuilt Germany's military, funded the entire process, and expanded their reach both to the west and to the east. It's time now to consider how Hitler and the OKW intended to use their forces. In other words, let's talk strategy, operations, tactics, and doctrine. In Germany's case, Hitler's strategic endgame was to expand his Reich's territory into Eastern Europe, thus conquering Lebensraum, or vital space for the German people. Now, due to its central position on the European landmass, Germany was always at deadly risk of having to wage war on two fronts, and according to Gerhard Gross, writing for the Journal of Military and Strategic Studies in 2011, the key to avoiding such occurrence rested in the Heer's excellent operational capabilities. More precisely, the General Staff prepared for a war of maneuver in which highly mobile, well-trained units would conduct combined arms offensives against clearly established main points of effort. By using speed, surprise, and initiative, officers were encouraged to envelop and neutralize enemy forces on Germany's borders, thus preventing their buildup. Such a way of war had already been theorized since the 19th century by German General Helmut Moltke. This approach, dubbed Strategy of Annihilation, comprised three phases: rapid mobilization, deployment, and total or decisive battle in which the enemy armies were forced to surrender. The realities of World War I, in which defensive weapons and tactics outperformed offensive ones, nullified any attempt to enact a successful strategy strategy of annihilation. But advances in tank technology brought Moltke's ideas back to the table. During the mid-1930s, Colonel and later General Heinz Guderian theorized the use of concentrated armored units up to division level to conduct his version of annihilation, which he called Beungungskrieg, or War of Movement, the doctrine which was later dubbed Blitzkrieg. But Guderian's War of Movement was not exclusive to Germany. Just as an example, Soviet military theorists Georgy Isserson and Mikhail Tukhachevsky had developed a similar concept, deep battle, since the mid-1920s and formalized it in a 1936 Red Army regulation manual. When the Spanish Civil War erupted the same year, the Soviet Union deployed substantial tank detachments in support of the Republican government against Francisco Franco's nationalist insurgents. The Soviets, however, failed to successfully conduct deep battle on this occasion, which convinced Red Army commanders and military observers worldwide that tanks were best deployed as infantry support vehicles, divided piecemeal across standard non-armored divisions. As a result, when World War II erupted in September 1939, the German Land Army was the only one to field substantial armored units, able to act as a steel-clad spearhead against forces which were numerically superior but tactically inferior. So that covers the Land Army. How about the Luftwaffe and the Kriegsmarine? The more innovative contribution of the Luftwaffe during the early months of the war was its use as artillery from the sky in a support function to advanced armored and mechanized infantry units. This means that fighters and dive bombers, such as the legendary Stukas, would be used to target enemy formations from the sky, weakening their defenses, their resolve, and their morale, allowing for their pals on the ground to punch through the front line. The Kriegsmarine is perhaps the least celebrated of the three services of the Wehrmacht, and yet its commander, Admiral Erich Raeder, possessed a sharp strategic mind. As of 1937, he foresaw that a land war in Europe would sooner or later set Germany on a collision course with Britain, which meant squaring off with the Royal Navy, the best and largest in the world. Raeder devised a rearmament program planned Zebra, which would almost quadruple the size of Germany's navy and bring it almost on par with the British. But this plan required 9 years for completion, and Hitler wasn't particularly known for his patience. Raeder therefore had to maximize the strategic impact of his relatively small forces. To do this, he relegated some of his largest capital ships, such as the battleship Admiral Tirpitz, to the role of fleet in being. This indicates when one or more naval units are kept in port most of the time. But due to its sheer presence, a fleet in being requires the enemy to invest precious time and resources in managing its threat potential. Smaller vessels, from the category of pocket battleship down to torpedo boats and U-boats, were then used in a commerce raiding capacity. The main aim of the Kriegsmarine was therefore not to wrest control of the seas from the Royal Navy, but to target merchant convoys to Britain and Allied forces in general, thus placing the enemy under chokehold. As Raeder put it, the task of naval warfare in extraterritorial waters is war on merchant shipping. Combat action, even against inferior naval forces, is not an aim in itself and is therefore not to be sought. And now, let's put all the pieces into practice. On the 1st of September 1939, the Wehrmacht invaded Poland. On the 3rd, Britain and France declared war on Germany, and World War II was on. Despite a heroic resistance, the Polish army capitulated on the 6th of October. Much of the victory can be ascribed to the use of armoured divisions against defenders who could field only light tankettes. But the Reich also had to thank their unlikely ally, the Soviet Union. As per the clauses of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of August 23, 1939, the Red Army invaded Poland from the east on September 17th. Poland's Western allies too did their part in securing this early success. After promising Warsaw that they would attack Germany, the French army conducted an inconclusive offensive into the Saarlands, which achieved little gain before returning to base. We've got an entire video dedicated to this almost forgotten invasion. Could the Allies really have crushed Germany right at the start of the World War II, if you're interested in learning more about that. But in any event, the next invasions took place on the 9th of April 1940, targeting Denmark and Norway. Gaining control of Norway was essential to secure imports of iron ore from Sweden, and gaining control of Denmark was essential to secure Norway. The small and ill-equipped Danish army capitulated in a single day, whilst Norway resisted until June the 10th. In this case, the mountainous terrain of the Scandinavian country did not make for an ideal tank playground, but the Wehrmacht conducted effective amphibious and airborne assaults to neutralize stiff Norwegian resistance. Once again, the German forces received a great deal of help from the Western Allies. Anglo-French forces had planned to mine the waters of major Norwegian ports on April the 5th before landing in Norway. But the plan was postponed, allowing for the Wehrmacht to rock up, invited by local collaborationist Vidkun Quisling. In later stages of the campaign, Allied forces did conduct landings in Norway to oppose Hitler's progress, but they were generally ill-equipped for mountain warfare and were subject to strafing attacks from the Luftwaffe. While hostilities in Norway were still raging, on May the 10th, the Wehrmacht launched its largest attack to date against Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and France. Now, it turns out this campaign could have been stopped in its tracks right from the get-go. And this brings us back to Hans Oster, right-hand man to head of military intelligence Admiral Canaris. Oster was dead set on preventing Hitler's rabid dreams of hegemony. In 1939, Oster had become a close friend of Major Gisbertus Sass, the Dutch military attaché in Berlin. Oster informed him in advance of the German plans to invade France and the Benelux countries, initially slated for November 1939. Sass relayed the intelligence to his superior, General Reinders, who unfortunately did not take it seriously, adamant that Germany would never violate Dutch neutrality. We know that the November invasion was postponed until May 1940. But had Oster been taken more seriously, the Western powers could have been better prepared to stop the Wehrmacht's next and most successful exploit. This campaign was a masterful example of the principles of strategy of annihilation and Berwinguskrieg. The German Army C Group maintained static positions in front of France's main defensive barrier, the Maginot Line. But this was just a ruse to deter the French army from redeploying forces away from the line. Meanwhile, Army Group B advanced into the Netherlands, facing the Allied armies. But this was just a ruse again to distract the Allies from the real threat. General von Rundstedt's Army Group A, a large force of 44 divisions, 7 of them entirely armoured. As per an audacious plan conceived by General Guderian, Army Group A was to push through the hilly Ardennes forest in Belgium. This terrain was considered impenetrable to tanks and had been left largely unprotected by the Allies. As a result, Army Group A cut through weak defences, pouring into northern France and surrounding the bulk of the Allied armies in the Low Countries from the rear. When German armoured units met with their French counterparts, the latter proved to be superior in terms of training and weaponry, but Allied tanks were dispersed in an infantry support function and could not oppose the spearhead of Guderian's concentrated armour. Once again, German military innovation had received great helping hands from yet more mistakes of Allied leadership. The British Expeditionary Force, alongside other Allied troops, escaped total destruction at Dunkirk, but the French government capitulated on the 22nd of June. From here, for several months, the Heer was mostly busy with occupation duties. The Luftwaffe attempted unsuccessfully to establish air superiority against the Royal Air Force during the Battle of Britain, so it was time for the Kriegsmarine to shine. Admiral Raeder's U-boat scored notable hits on the Royal Navy as early as September the 17th and October the 14th, 1939, by sinking the aircraft carrier Courageous and the battleship Royal Oak. But the sub's main target was merchant shipping. By the end of 1939, 110 cargoes had gone to the bottom. And in the period from January to October 1940, the Kriegsmarine enjoyed a success streak remembered as the Happy Time, in which U-boats and surface vessels sank or seized more than 2.1 million tons worth of Allied merchant shipping in the Atlantic and the North Sea. Hitler's land forces resumed offensive operations in April of 1941, this time targeting the Balkan region. Their dual objectives were the occupation of Greece and Yugoslavia. The former nation had successfully repelled a poorly planned Italian attack launched on October 28, 1940. The strenuous Greek resistance had attracted British forces in the area and inspired Bulgaria and Yugoslavia to resist Hitler's courtship to join the Axis. Both countries, alongside Hungary and Slovakia, eventually joined Berlin and Rome, but on March 27, 1941, a military coup overthrew the regency of Prince Paul of Yugoslavia and reverted to a policy of neutrality. On April 6th, the Heer and the Luftwaffe attacked Yugoslavia and Greece from their bases in Hungary, Romania and Bulgaria. 5 days later, 15 Italian divisions also attacked northern Yugoslavia, and by the 17th, Belgrade capitulated. The brave Greek defenders, already worn out by a victorious yet costly campaign against Italy, resisted until the 22nd. Commonwealth and local units still resisted on Crete until the Germans launched a daring airborne assault on the 20th of May. Despite suffering heavy casualties, the Germans eventually triumphed on the 31st. That said, while mostly defeated in Europe, British and Commonwealth troops enjoyed success in North Africa. Overruling the objections of General Graziani, Italian commander in Libya, Mussolini ordered an attack against British-held Egypt back in June 1940. Marred by poor supplies and equipment, the Italian offensive was first defeated by the Desert, then by General Wavell and O'Connor in December. By early February 1941, they could have seized Libya's capital, Tripoli, but the relocation of British forces to Greece stalled the counter-offensive, allowing for the arrival of German reinforcements, the Africa Corps, under legendary General Erwin Rommel. The Desert Fox effectively led the Italo-German troops into retaking the lost Libyan territory in March and April. The Allied-held city of Tobruk, however, resisted strenuously, preventing a push into Egypt. Moreover, Rommel's supply lines were now overstretched, and he was forced to halt this advance in June of 1941. The 22nd day of that month marked the beginning of the Wehrmacht's largest operation to date, Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. Once again, Axis forces steamrolled their enemies. Once again, a large chunk of that success can be attributed to the failings of Hitler's adversaries and the well-trained German forces. In this case, Joseph Stalin believed that the Germans would abide by the Molotov-Ribbentrop Non-Aggression Pact and ignored mounting intelligence of Axis build-up on the Soviet borders. Moreover, once again showing a large part of Germany's initial success had a lot to do with mistakes on the other side, the communist dictator had shot himself in the foot some 5 years prior. You see, from August 1936 to March 1938, Stalin unleashed the Great Purge to eliminate his political rivals. This purge decimated the officer corps of the Red Army as the secret police arrested or executed an astounding 178 generals. Among them was Marshal Tukhachevsky, the leading expert on the effective use of armored units according to deep battle principles. The few surviving generals avoided any association with the executed marshal, relegating deep battle into oblivion. This doctrine was partially resurrected by Minister of Defense Marshal Timoshenko in late 1940 with the creation of 29 mechanized infantry corps by early 1941. These corps fielded a total of 24,000 tanks against some 3,000 on the Axis side. Unfortunately, the corps commanders lacked the necessary training and experience to lead them effectively. As a result, most of these units were destroyed in the first weeks of Barbarossa. And so it was that the Heer and the Luftwaffe reached the gates of Moscow by December 1941. But the tide was about to turn. The period of unmatched victories would soon be over. But to summarize, the impressive war record of the Wehrmacht from September 1939 to December 1941 stemmed from a variety of factors. The German military had been building up their forces, arsenal, and capability since the 1920s, even before the Nazis took power. Then throughout the 1930s, Hitler and his acolytes further prepared for war by incurring massive debts as well as acquiring new territories and their resources without needing to resort to open war per se. All the while, they were also heavily training the troops that would spearhead the initial attacks. When hostilities did start, the OKW, Oberkommando Wehrmacht, deployed in the front line the best trained, best equipped, armored, mechanized, and motorized units. This allowed the Germans to effectively execute the well-established Prussian offensive doctrine in a period in which every major power still played on the defensive. Such an advantage gave the Wehrmacht the opportunity to concentrate on one adversary at a time, defeating them in detail. This resulted in short individual campaigns against weaker or unprepared adversaries, which did not place unsustainable strain on the industrial and logistics complex of the Reich. On the contrary, the rapidly occupied territories provided the German economy with further cash, supplies, and forced labor to help snowball efforts on the war front. And last but not least, German forces benefited from an enormous advantage: Allied strategic incompetence, deafness to sound intelligence, and in some cases, inferior trained troops and officers. But everything changed after December 1941. The German military doctrine and war economy were well suited for the conduct of quick campaigns and occupation of enemy countries close to its boundaries. But this characteristic, which gave Germany the initial edge, was one of the causes of its downfall. As of early 1942, Germany was still facing a yet undefeated Britain. The stubborn Soviets had halted the advance of Barbarossa at the gates of Moscow, and the US had just entered the fray, which meant that the Third Reich was facing three adversaries with insurmountable geographic advantages, sustainable economies, and strategic defensive depth. Three characteristics which are the perfect antidote to strategy of annihilation and Verwundungskrieg. Had Hitler been wiser at this stage of the game, he may well have been able to switch tactics and fortify and make deals to keep at least a part of what Germany had won. But as we covered in a recent video on our sister channel Highlight History, as the war progressed, the Führer was progressively more and more not in his right mind, and indeed is unlikely to have survived many years past the war if he'd not taken his own life or been captured, owing to some rather interesting things little discussed today. On September 2nd, 1945, hundreds of servicemen and representatives from every Allied nation gathered on the deck of the battleship USS Missouri, anchored in Tokyo Bay. Under the watchful eye of General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Allied Commander in the Pacific, representatives of the defeated Empire of Japan signed the formal instruments of surrender, officially bringing the Second World War, the deadliest conflict in modern history, to an end. The road to Allied victory in the Pacific was a long and brutal one, claiming the lives of over 33 million soldiers and civilians. But while Japan announced its unconditional surrender on August the 15th, the path to the formal ceremony of September the 2nd was fraught and uncertain, involving dozens of tense negotiations and a harrowing surrender flight that nearly upended the entire peace process. This is a forgotten story of how the Second World War actually ended. In July 1945, the leaders of the Allied nations met in the German city of Potsdam to hammer out the details of the coming post-war peace. But while Nazi Germany had capitulated 9 weeks before, in the Pacific, the Empire of Japan doggedly fought on. While US B-29 bombers conducted round-the-clock firebombing raids against Tokyo and other major Japanese cities, 2 million Allied personnel were massing in preparation for Operation Downfall, the planned amphibious invasion of the Japanese home islands. With the Japanese population expected to fight frantically to the death, the predicted casualties were horrific, as high as 800,000 Allied servicemen and 10 million Japanese soldiers and civilians. The number one priority of the Potsdam Conference was thus to convince the Japanese to accept unconditional surrender and bring the war in the Pacific to a swift end. On July the 26th, the delegates issued the Potsdam Declaration, which read in part, "We, representing the hundreds of millions of our countrymen, have conferred and agreed that Japan shall be given an opportunity to end this war. The prodigious land, sea, and air forces of the United States, the British Empire, and of China are poised to strike the final blows upon Japan. The full application of our military power, backed by our resolve, will mean the inevitable and complete destruction of the Japanese armed forces, and just as inevitably, the utter devastation of the Japanese homeland. The following are our terms. We will not deviate from them. There are no alternatives. We shall brook no delay. There must be eliminated for all time the authority and influence of those who have decided and misled the people of Japan into embarking on world conquest, for we insist that a new order of peace, security, and justice will be impossible until irresponsible militarism is driven from the world. We do not intend that the Japanese shall be enslaved as a race or destroyed as a nation, but stern justice shall be meted out to all war criminals, including those who have visited cruelties upon our prisoners. The Japanese government shall remove all obstacles to the revival and strengthening of democratic tendencies among the Japanese people. Freedom of speech, of religion, and of thought, as well as respect for the fundamental human rights, shall be established. We call upon the government of Japan to proclaim now the unconditional surrender of all the Japanese armed forces and to provide proper and adequate assurances of their good faith in such action. The alternative for Japan is prompt and utter destruction." Despite the apocalyptic ultimatum, the Japanese rejected the Potsdam Declaration and vowed to keep fighting to the bitter end. Consequently, on August the 6th, the B-29 Enola Gay dropped Little Boy, a 15-kiloton nuclear weapon, on the city of Hiroshima, killing an estimated 90,000 soldiers and civilians. The next day, US President Harry S. Truman issued a statement announcing it was to spare the Japanese people from utter destruction that the ultimatum of July 26th was issued at Potsdam. Their leaders promptly rejected that ultimatum. If they do not now accept our terms, they may expect a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth. Yet the Japanese continued to ignore Allied ultimatums, and on August the 9th, another B-29 Boxcar dropped the 21-kiloton Fat Man bomb on Nagasaki, killing 80,000 people. When the Japanese again refused to surrender, the US Air Force began preparing for a third atomic strike. This proved unnecessary, for on August the 15th, the Japanese people turned on their radios to hear a shocking broadcast. The voice of Emperor Hirohito announcing that Japan would accept unconditional surrender. The traditional narrative of the end of World War II is that the atomic bombings were directly responsible for the eventual Japanese capitulation. This assumption, however, has been since challenged by historians. After all, since June 1944, Allied firebombing raids on Japanese cities had killed nearly 10 times as many people as the atomic bombings, while having little effect on Japan's will to fight. Indeed, in the minutes of the Imperial War Cabinet between August the 6th and the 15th, the atomic bombings are barely mentioned. Instead, the event which forced Japan's hand was more likely the Soviet Red Army's invasion of Japanese-occupied Manchuria on August the 9th, the same day as the bombing of Nagasaki. Now facing an unwinnable war on two fronts, the Japanese leadership had decided which of the Allies would grant the more favourable terms of surrender and allow them to, as best they could, save face for the imperial family, and with the general Japanese public who'd been for quite some time fed lies about how the war effort was going and concerning Japan's unquestionable superiority. On that note, one of the major issues preventing the Japanese accepting unconditional surrender was the fate of the emperor and the Japanese monarchy. Realizing that the communist Soviets were unlikely to allow the emperor to continue reigning, the Japanese thus decided to surrender to the Western Allies. Yet even this decision was nearly overturned, as on the eve of the emperor's broadcast, a cadre of fanatical army officers led by Major Kenji Hatanaka tried to launch a coup d'etat, murdering the commander of the 1st Imperial Guards Division and attempting to place Hirohito under house arrest. However, the conspirators failed to convince the rest of the army to overthrow the emperor, and the coup failed. Concurrently to Emperor Hirohito's radio broadcast, the Japanese government, under Prime Minister Kentaro Suzuki, transmitted an official acknowledgement of the Potsdam Declaration to Allied Supreme Headquarters. In response, President Truman called an emergency meeting in the Oval Office, after which he held a press conference in which he announced to the world, "I have received this afternoon a message from the Japanese government in reply to the message forwarded to that government by the Secretary of State on August the 11th. I deem this reply a full acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration, which specifies the unconditional surrender of Japan. In the reply, there is no qualification. Arrangements are now being made for the formal signing of the surrender terms at the earliest possible moment. General Douglas MacArthur has been appointed the Supreme Allied Commander to receive the Japanese surrender. Great Britain, Russia, and China will be represented by high-ranking officers. Meantime, the Allied armed forces have been ordered to suspend offensive action. The proclamation of VJ Day must await upon the formal signing of the terms by Japan." Indeed, despite the formal declaration of surrender, there was much left to do. The 4 million Japanese troops still in the field would have to be stood down and disarmed, a task that would require considerable negotiation and coordination. But getting the Japanese delegates to the negotiation table would prove an unexpected challenge. Not only might Allied fighter pilots accidentally shoot down the aircraft carrying the delegates, but so too might fanatical Japanese commanders looking to stall the surrender process. Furthermore, the pilots flying the aircraft might also choose to crash them in a final act of defiance. To prevent any of this from happening, at 9:52 a.m. on August the 15th, the same day as Hirohito's announcement, General MacArthur sent the following instructions to the Japanese government. The Supreme Commander of the Allied Powers directs the Japanese Imperial Government to send to his headquarters at Manila, Philippine Islands, a competent representative empowered to receive in the name of the Emperor of Japan, the Japanese Imperial Government, and the Japanese Imperial General Headquarters certain requirements for carrying into effect the terms of surrender. The above representative will present to the Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers upon his arrival a document authenticated by the Emperor of Japan, empowering him to receive the requirements of the Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers. The representative will be accompanied by competent advisors representing the Japanese Army, the Japanese Navy, and Japanese Air Forces. The latter advisor will be one thoroughly familiar with airdrome facilities in the Tokyo area. The party will travel in a Japanese airplane to an airdrome on the island of Lashima, from which point they will be transported to Manila, Philippine Islands in a United States airplane. They will be returned to Japan in the same manner. Such airplane will be painted all white and will bear upon the side of its fuselage and the top and bottom of each wing green crosses easily recognizable at 500 yards. The airplane will proceed to the airdrome on the island of Lashima, identified by 2 white crosses prominently displayed in the center of the runway. Weather permitting, the airplane will depart from Sato Misaki between the hours of 0800 and 1100 hours Tokyo time on the 17th day of August 1945. In communications regarding this flight, the code designation Bataan will be employed. The airplane will approach Lashima on an able course of 180 degrees and circle landing field at 1,000 feet or below the cloud layer until joined by an escort of United States Army P-38s, which will lead it to able landing. Such escort may join the airplane prior to arrival at Lashima. The requirements that the aircraft's Hinamaru, or Rising Sun insignia, be painted over was intended not only to prevent Allied forces from accidentally shooting them down, but also to humble and humiliate the Japanese delegation, as were the prescribed call signs Bataan 1 and Bataan 2, a pointed reference to the infamous Bataan Death March of April 1942, in which some 6,000 American and Filipino prisoners of war perished. The aircraft chosen to carry the Japanese delegation were a pair of Mitsubishi G4M twin-engine light bombers, better known by the Allied call sign Betty. One aircraft was an unarmed transport variant, while the other was stripped of its armament specifically for this mission. As per MacArthur's instructions, both aircraft were painted white all over with green crosses on the fuselage, wings, and tail. The Japanese surrender delegation comprised 16 men and was headed by Lieutenant General Toroshiro Kawabe, Deputy Chief of the Imperial Japanese Army General Staff. The Chief of the General Staff, General Toshihiro Umezu, had refused to participate in the surrender negotiations and appointed Kawabe in his place. In addition to Kawabe, the delegation also counted among its members Rear Admiral Ichiro, Captain Hidemi Yoshida, and Captain Toshichi Omae of the Imperial Navy, Katsuo Okazaki of the Government Research Division, Major General Morikikazu Amano, and Lieutenant Colonel Masao Matsuda of the Imperial Army, and Army Lieutenants Harumi Takuchi and Sadao Otaki, who served as translators. While the meeting with MacArthur in Manila was originally scheduled for August the 17th, due to delays in preparing the delegation and their aircraft, it was moved back to the 19th. At daybreak on the 19th, the delegation gathered at Haneda Airport on the west side of Tokyo Bay and boarded a Nakajima L2D, a Japanese-manufactured version of the American Douglas DC-3 airliner, which had also been painted white with green crosses. After a 50-minute flight across the bay to Kisazaru Airfield, the delegation split into two groups and boarded their modified Betty bombers. By 7:07 a.m., both aircraft were airborne and headed southeast towards Oshima in the Ryukyu Islands near Okinawa. The delegation was on edge as they made the perilous journey toward Allied territory, for they were aware that Captain Yasuna Ozono, commander of the 302nd Naval Air Group near Tokyo, had ordered his pilots to shoot down the surrender flight at all costs. What they did not know was that Ozono had been overruled by his staff and subsequently committed seppuku. Nevertheless, the flight proceeded in tense silence until 11:15 a.m. when, near the southern tip of Kyushu Island, it was met by an escort of two North American B-25 Mitchell light bombers from the 345th Bomb Group Air Apaches and 12 Lockheed P-38 Lightning fighters of the 49th Fighter Group. The two squadrons had been specially selected for this historic mission due to their illustrious combat records, with the 49th in particular having more confirmed victories than any other fighter group in the Pacific Theater. A Boeing B-17 Fortress of the 6th Emergency Rescue Squadron was also on hand with an airdroppable lifeboat in case any of the aircraft were forced to ditch in the ocean. But no sooner was contact made that the first hiccup of the mission took place, as the Japanese and American aircraft suddenly lost radio contact with each other. The flight was forced into a holding pattern until the issue was resolved, whereupon they resumed their course for Oshima. At 12:40 p.m, the flight spotted the large white crosses specially painted on Oshima's Birch airstrip and lined up for landing. At that moment, however, another hiccup appeared as a stray Mitchell bomber broke into the formation, forcing the first Betty to swing around and try again. Finally, both aircraft were safely on the ground, albeit surrounded by hundreds of American servicemen whose feeling towards the newly arrived delegation were, after 4 years of savage fighting, ambivalent at best. As Lieutenant Takeuchi later recalled, "As our plane approached the runway, we saw what seemed to be thousands of American soldiers forming a solid ring around the field. It was obvious this was not security, but merely curiosity. But so many. A sudden jolt. Our plane contacted the runway firmly, only to become airborne again for a few moments. I learned later that our pilot was so impressed by the crowds of Americans that he neglected to lower the landing flaps, causing a higher sink rate than expected. The moment of being confronted with our former enemy had arrived. After a pause, General Kawabe rose firmly to his feet and strode to the door. My own fears and uneasiness were put aside with the thought of the heavy burden placed upon this man and the personal anxiety he must be undergoing." As General Kawabe and the rest of the delegation walked down the sun-baked coral runway towards the path, the Douglas C-54 Skymaster transport that would carry them on to Manila, their path lined every 20 feet with extra-tall military policemen. As General Kawabe and the rest of the delegation walked down the sun-baked coral runway towards the Douglas C-54 Skymaster transport that would carry them to Manila, their path was lined every 20 feet with an extra-tall military policeman. They had been specially chosen by General MacArthur for their intimidation factor. Meanwhile, the gathered crowd looked on in silent curiosity. That is until one member of the delegation emerged from the Betty carrying a conciliatory bouquet of flowers. At this, the crowd erupted into jeers and shouts, telling the unfortunate officer exactly where he could stick said flowers. The Japanese were then met by a delegation of American officers to whom Kawabe presented his credentials. Without any exchange of salutes or greetings, the delegation were then led to the shade beneath the transport aircraft, where, as translator, Lieutenant Atake later recalled a curious scene playing out. Standing behind the senior American officer was a darker-skinned American acting as an interpreter. Very formally, instructions were passed to him with the intention of their being related to us in Japanese. It was here that I would have broken out in uncontrolled laughter had the tenseness of the situation not prevented it. I could not hear the words in English, but only a few words the interpreter relayed to us sounded anything at all like Japanese. When this gibberish ended, we were motioned aboard the American craft that was to take us to Manila. We left with the feeling that the Americans were fully satisfied that they had flawlessly conveyed their message to us, yet I had no idea of one word that was said. Thankfully, this farcical incident had no adverse effect on the proceedings, and the delegates flew in relative comfort aboard the American aircraft, being served a hearty lunch and coffee with real sugar, a luxury unavailable in Japan for several years. At 6 p.m, the C-54 landed at Nichols Field on the Philippine island of Luzon, where the delegation was met by Major General Charles A. Willoughby, MacArthur's chief of intelligence. Like the MPs at Oshima, Willoughby, who stood 6 feet 2 inches tall, had been specifically selected to intimidate the Japanese. The drive into Manila, which just 5 months before 6,500 American and Filipino troops had died recapturing, was equally unnerving. As Atake later recalled, "We left Nichols Field in a parade of staff cars. As we drove down Dewey, now Roxas Boulevard, Filipinos along the way paused to stare. Seeing Japanese inside the cars, many onlookers sneered and loudly shouted the Japanese words Bakayaro, or idiot arsehole, at us. I could not help but jokingly remark, is that all we were able to teach these people while we occupy the Philippines?" The members of the delegation were billeted at a colonial mansion known as Rosario Manor, where they were treated to a feast the likes of which, thanks to wartime food shortages, they had not tasted in years. After dinner, the delegation was summoned to Manila City Hall, where the conference with MacArthur was to take place. As Ataki recalled, the colonel requested that the Japanese officers leave their swords behind. I sensed a tenseness throughout our delegation, and our eyes all turned toward our general, wondering what his reply would be. With little hesitation, Kawabe's words to be passed on to the colonel were, "Sir, our swords are part of our uniforms. We would like to be permitted to wear them, but we will leave them outside the conference room with our hats if you desire." The colonel nodded, and the procedure was followed. This compromise was emblematic of MacArthur's approach overall to the surrender process. MacArthur understood that the Japanese expected to be treated with the same brutality they themselves showed to prisoners and conquered peoples, and opted to take a firm but fair stance in order to allay these fears. This strategy paid off handsomely, as Ataki later explained. There was much discussion of this early occupation date, August 25th. Because of the unpredictable reactions of both the Japanese civilians and elements, an attempted occupation at this early date might have its misfortunes. With little hesitation, Lieutenant General Richard Sutherland, MacArthur's chief of staff, granted a 3-day extension. This to us, but was one example of the fairness with which the Americans handled many problems that arose. It was far different from the treatment we had expected, but this approach probably prevented consequences that the Japanese might not have been able to control. Indeed, this approach is credited with saving countless lives by preventing the mass outbreak of insurgent violence across occupied Japan. The conference ran from 9 p.m. on the 19th into the small hours of the morning on the 20th, during which time MacArthur, Sutherland, and the Japanese hammered out the schedule and other details for the demobilization of the Japanese armed forces and the American occupation of the Japanese home islands, all of which were dutifully translated into Japanese by Lieutenants Takeuchi and Ataki. Meanwhile, the 12 crew members of the Betty bombers that had ferried the delegation to Lashima were kept in secured quarters on the island and well taken care of. The two groups were reunited on the afternoon of the 20th, whereupon they reboarded their white-painted aircraft and set off for Japan. Unfortunately, one of the Bettys ran into a ditch while taxiing, damaging its landing gear and rendering it temporarily unflyable. 5 members of the delegation, having already gotten used to the quality and abundance of American food, volunteered to stay behind. This included Ataki, who was billeted with a Japanese-American, or Nisei lieutenant. The two got along famously, drinking sake and exchanging stories long into the night. Meanwhile, the surrender documents were divided in two, and the remaining delegates boarded the second Betty. As before, they were joined by a pair of B-25 Mitchell bombers from the 345th Bombardment Group, who escorted them for a distance of 88 kilometers before heading home. The rest of the flight was largely uneventful, but as the aircraft neared the southern coast of Honshu Island, disaster struck, as Lieutenant Takeuchi later recalled. "I must have dozed, for I was startled when I felt a hand firmly shaking my shoulder. In the dim glow of the cabin, I recognized one of the pilots as he shouted to us, 'We're going to ditch. Everyone, life jackets on.' The engines sounded as though they were running smoothly, but I hastily donned my life preserver, as I was told to do, and after further instructions, covered my head with my hands to prepare for a crash landing. I was totally confused as to what was taking place. I passed my leather briefcase between my chest and lap. My mind was filled not only with thoughts of my own danger, but also with the consequences of losing those surrender instructions. Would the tedious hours of conference in Manila, the product of which I was clutching, disappear with me into the inky waters below? But incomparably more important would be the reactions from both opposing forces when it became known that the Japanese delegations and the surrender arrangement plans had not reached Tokyo. Would either side, or both, believe that the other had perpetrated an act of deception and so continued the fighting, with the loss of many more lives? The aircraft came down in shallow surf off the coast near Hamamatsu, some 200 kilometers short of Tokyo. Miraculously, no one on board was seriously injured, and with the help of local fishermen, the delegation were able to wade safely ashore. From Hamamatsu, they arranged to be flown by Army bomber to Chofu Airfield outside Tokyo, from where they reached the Imperial Palace and delivered the surrender instructions to Prince Hideyoshi Kuni, the newly appointed Prime Minister. The following day, the rest of the delegates and their half of the surrender documents arrived in Tokyo, following an uneventful flight from Lashima. As Hideyoshi Kuni later recalled, the Emperor was quite relieved. He was thankful not only for the safe return of all his envoys, but that the dark days of the war had now ended. It was later determined that the ditching of the first Betty had been simply caused by a translation error. American mechanics on Lashima had mixed up the conversion between litres and gallons and filled up the Betty with only 1/3 of the fuel needed to reach Tokyo. It was but one of the many translation hiccups that nearly derailed the delicate surrender process. But even with the surrender instructions safely in Tokyo, there was still much work to do. In time, entire army, air force, and naval units had to formally surrender and hand over their armies to the Allies. Thus, over the following 2 weeks, dozens of Green Cross flights of specially marked aircraft zipped their way across the Pacific, carrying hundreds of Japanese delegates to meetings with their Allied counterparts. The whole process finally culminated on September the 2nd in Tokyo Bay, when the formal instruments of surrender were signed and the Second World War officially came to an end. Yet despite General MacArthur's official firm but fair policy, he made sure to drive home in every manner possible that the Japanese Empire was well and truly defeated. Hanging from a bulkhead above the surrender table was the very flag flown by Commodore Matthew Perry when he steamed into Tokyo Bay in 1854, opening Japan to the Western world. And while the Allied copy of the surrender documents was bound in gilded leather, the Japanese copy was bound in rough, unadorned canvas. And for yet another unnecessarily humiliating World War II surrender, please do check out our previous video, yet another of Hitler's ultimate dick moves. Nazi Germany officially surrendered on the 7th of May 1945, with the war still raging in the Pacific against Japan and sporting a popularity rate at around 83%, Sir Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill seemed a shoo-in to maintain his position as Prime Minister of the British Empire. Just before the announcement of the results of the election, Churchill had been at the Potsdam Conference with US President Truman and Joseph Stalin, only intending to travel home briefly to accept his victory and then back to the conference. Yet, a funny thing happens on July the 26th, 1945. The voting populace of the UK, which had turned out in record numbers of 73%, had decided to collectively say, well, thank you for your service, Winston, but we've decided to go in a different direction. It was a landslide defeat that shocked the world. While in more modern times you might think some sort of scandalous affair or offensive comment may have whipped up the mob on the interwebs, precipitating such a massive electoral fall in the span of just a couple of months, but there was no such issue here. So what happened? How did this wildly successful politician, frequently named among the top prime ministers ever in the nation, at the height of his popularity no less, and who had just helped successfully guide Britain through one of its most harrowing periods of its storied history, not just lose, but lose in a landslide? And not only this, making the whole thing even more inexplicable, he lost to a man who one of said man's own party members, Aneurin Bevan, stated seems determined to make a trumpet sound like a tin whistle. Or as the chairman of the Daily Mirror, Cecil King, would remark in 1940, he was of very limited intelligence and no personality. If one heard he was getting £6 a week in the service of the East Ham Corporation, one would be surprised he was earning so much. Or let's not stop there, as famed social reformer Beatrice Webb would remark, he looked and spoke like an insignificant elderly clerk without distinction in the voice, manner, or substance of his discourse. To realise that this little non-entity is presumably the future Prime Minister is pitiable. Or, as Churchill himself would allegedly quip about his opponent, he is a modest man, but then he has so much to be modest about. The demeaning quotes about the man Churchill lost to go on and on and on, and his own party before, during and after the election likewise tried to oust him as their leader, only to see this quiet, oft-forgotten individual who rapidly rose from a middle-class background to the heights of power, defy them all, and go on to become one of the greatest prime ministers in the history of the nation, often even ranked above Churchill himself, despite only serving in the position for a handful of years. As ever, of course, the devil is in the fascinating detail, so let us dive in and see what specifically happened to see a titan of history defeated by a man no one outside of the UK even knows the name of, yet shaped the Britain we have today, arguably significantly more so than Churchill ever did. To begin with, a little bit of a brief background for the uninitiated. Leading up to becoming Prime Minister in 1940, Winston Churchill had a rather notable career. Born in his family's Blenheim Palace on November 30th, 1874, Churchill was a member of the prominent Spencer aristocratic family on his father's side. As for his mother, she was the daughter of a wealthy American businessman, Leonard Jerome. In the interim between his birth and 1940, Churchill's exploits included variously serving as a soldier in British India, as well as taking part in the Second Boer War, and even at one point he became a famous war correspondent and author. On this latter and oft-forgotten factoid of history is that he once even wrote a fictional novel with romance undertones called Savrola, A Tale of the Revolution in Laurania, serialized in 1898 and later published as a complete book in 1900. Later in life, Churchill would even win a Nobel Prize in Literature. As for his prolific writing, he would variously note this was one of his methods for staving off his black dog or frequent bouts of depression. Back to his political life, and in 1900, it was in October of 1900, at the age of just 25, that he was first elected as a member of parliament, and things more or less took off rapidly from there, including by World War I being selected as First Lord of the Admiralty, a position he briefly reprised during World War II, which for the uninitiated means he was the political head of the Royal Navy. In the years leading up to World War II, fascinatingly, with regards to some things that we'll be discussing later on, despite being a member of the Conservative Party, Churchill was an outspoken opponent of his party's policy of appeasement when it came to Hitler, stating, "A country like ours, possessed of immense territory and wealth, whose defense has been neglected, cannot avoid war by dilating upon its horrors, or even by a continuous display of pacific qualities, or by ignoring the fate of the victims of aggression elsewhere. War will be avoided in present circumstances only by the accumulation of deterrence against the aggressor." He also proposed a mutual defense pact for European nations that stood in the way of Germany expanding, and urged Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain to declare, if Germany were to invade Czechoslovakia, as seemed imminent, that Britain would declare war on Germany. Going the other way, instead, Chamberlain signed the Munich Agreement, allowing Germany to annex parts of Czechoslovakia. Churchill's efforts, however, were not totally in vain for his own popularity, with more and more supporters who also felt the British Empire's policy of appeasement was the wrong tack rallying behind him. Things picked up for him from there when, after Germany occupied Norway, the now named Norway debate resulted in a call for a vote of no confidence in Chamberlain's government. Ironically, during this, Churchill, as a member of said government, had to defend it, even as arguments were being made for him to lead the next government. Well, spare you the lengthy details, but needless to say, ultimately Churchill was chosen as Prime Minister of the eventual coalition government. He would state of this, "I felt as if I were walking with destiny, and that all my past life had been but a preparation for this hour and this trial." That said, nothing was smooth from here, and after France fell, there was a strong push to simply sue for peace with Germany, something Churchill strongly opposed, but with the help of Chamberlain, he was able to keep his position and use his talents as a public speaker to good use in convincing the public the right choice was to continue to fight. As did he, even after a heart attack on December 26, 1941, which was supposed to leave him bedridden for a few weeks to recover, but instead he simply soldiered on, and a mere 2 days later was giving a speech to the Canadian Parliament. So, fast forward to the victory over Germany in 1945, and at no point during his time as Prime Minister had Churchill's popularity ever dipped below 78%, and his efforts and actions during it have since generally seen him consistently ranked in the top 3 Prime Ministers in the history of the nation. Of course, with the end of the war with Germany, there was pressure to hold a general election. Comfortable in his popularity and the job his party had done throughout the war, Churchill did not fear defeat. However, he nonetheless felt it would be better to continue the coalition government until the war with Japan was over, something that was notably supported by a man by the name of Clement Attlee, the leader of the Labour Party and Churchill's deputy prime minister, who during the war had been tasked with managing matters on the domestic front so Churchill could focus on the war effort. In stark contrast to Churchill's aristocratic background, Attlee was born the 7th of 8 children to an upper-middle-class family in Surrey on January 3rd, 1883. After brief work as a lawyer and then an economics lecturer, Attlee jumped into politics before having all of that interrupted by World War I. After, however, his rise was rapid, first as mayor of Stepney, then member of parliament, and by 1935 the leader of the Labour Party, all despite widespread criticism of the man himself, with many a demeaning quote as previously alluded to. But while Attlee may not have been your typical larger-than-life stereotypical alpha-type leader, Margaret Thatcher would later note of him very accurately, quite contrary to the general tendency of politicians in the 1990s, he was all substance and no show. Going back to Churchill's wish to continue the coalition government until the war with Japan was ended, as noted, his deputy prime minister in Attlee agreed that would be best. And so it was that Attlee brought this proposal before his party to see how to proceed. Par for the course of his leadership style, however, Attlee did not give his opinion on the matter either way and let discourse about it proceed unguided from the top. Ultimately, his party almost unanimously decided to oppose the continuance. But that wasn't all. There was strong sentiment within the party that with an election looming, Attlee should step down, with the chairman of the national executive of the Labour Party, Harold Laski, writing to him that many within the party felt that, quote, "the continuance of your leadership is a grave hardship to our hopes of victory in the coming general election. Your resignation of the leadership would now be a great service to the party. Just as Mr. Churchill changed Auchinleck for Montgomery before El Alamein, so I suggest you owe it to the party to give it the chance to make a comparable change on the eve of this, the greatest of our battles." End quote. Rather than argue or really give any opinion about the matter, Attlee simply replied, "Dear Lasky, thanks for your letter, the contents of which have been noted." and then wrote to Churchill of the rejection of continuing the coalition government. Thus, an election was called for, and Churchill resigned on May 23, 1945, to await a vote. In the interim, King George VI charged Churchill with forming a new government, often called the Caretaker Ministry today, to oversee things during the election, with this ministry lasting from May 23 to July 26. And so it was that the unassuming Attlee, who wasn't even popular within his own party, and said Labour Party, which had never won a majority in their history, was pitted up against one of the most popular men in Britain, and against the Conservative Party, which had dominated for years and had just seen the nation through one of its most harrowing periods in history, and come out the other side on top. I mean, what could possibly go wrong? Well, it turns out, everything. And in fact, the election was already lost about 3 years before it even started, thanks to one document which we're going to get to in a bit, that would change British history. Just nobody, not even the Labour Party members, realised it until the day the votes were tallied. Of course, Churchill and the Conservative Party's campaign practices didn't exactly help matters. While it seems they'd already lost before they'd begun, their shockingly tone-deaf campaign certainly did nothing to turn the tide, and Churchill himself, known for his amazing oration, continually put his foot in his mouth in remarkably boneheaded ways, more akin to political discussions on the artist formerly known as Twitter than what we think of when conjuring up thoughts of Winston Churchill. The most famous instance of this was Churchill's infamous Gestapo speech against Attlee and Labour. Leading up to the speech, Churchill's wife Clementine and several others had advised him to take that Gestapo part of the speech out, but he doggedly soldiered on. So what exactly did Churchill say? No socialist government conducting the entire life and industry of the country could afford to allow free, sharp, or violently worded expressions of public discontent. They would have to fall back on some form of Gestapo, no doubt very humanely directed in the first instance. They will gather all the power to the Supreme Party and the party leaders, rising like stately pinnacles above their vast bureaucracies of civil servants, no longer servants and no longer civil. Needless to say, comparing his own deputy prime minister in Attlee and the Labour Party Attlee led, who'd done a bang-up job during the war handling the domestic front so Churchill could focus on the war, to members of the Gestapo, didn't sit well with the people for reasons outlined by Churchill's own daughter Sarah, who would also try to reason with her father on this point. She stated, "They will certainly not tolerate totalitarianism, but they will not understand why socialism leads to this, because socialism as practiced in the war did no one harm and quite a lot of people good. The children of this country have never been so well fed or healthy. What milk there was shared equally. The rich did not die because their meat ration was no larger than the poor, and there is no doubt that this common sharing and feeling of sacrifice was one of the strongest bonds that unified us. So why, they say, cannot this common feeling of sacrifice be made to work as effectively in peace?" As for Attlee himself, the next day after Churchill's little early form of Godwin's Law, as an online discussion grows larger, the probability of a comparison to involving Nazis or Hitler approaches 1, Attlee would state, "When I listened to the Prime Minister's speech last night, I realised at once what was his object. He wanted the electors to understand how great was the difference between Winston Churchill, the great leader in war of a united nation, and Mr. Churchill, the party leader of the Conservatives. He feared lest those who had accepted his leadership in war might be tempted out of gratitude for having followed him further. I thank him for having disillusioned them so thoroughly. Sick burn." Nevertheless, seemingly not reading the room, Churchill would double down on this sentiment in later speeches in the following broadcast, stating, "In the socialist system, all effective and healthy opposition and the natural change of parties in office from time to time would necessarily come to an end, and a political police would be required to enforce an absolute and permanent system upon the nation." And yet again, in his next, "Under socialism, central government is to plan for all our lives and tell us exactly where we are to go and what we are to do, and any resistance to their commands will be punished." And that no change of government would be allowed under them because their executive, quote, "could not allow itself to be challenged or defeated at any time in any form of parliament they might allow." The level of tone deaf this was to the people of the nation cannot be understated. As to why. First, as Churchill's daughter Sarah has pointed out, the people had just seen how even in the worst of times, some of these so-called socialist ideals instituted by the Labour Party during the war kept things running relatively smoothly, regardless of the otherwise extreme circumstances. But there was another huge factor, which brings us back to the aforementioned empire-changing document, the Social Insurance and Allied Services Command 6404, aka the Beveridge Report, publishing in November of 1942, written by economist William Beveridge with contributions by his wife, mathematician Janet Beveridge. Among other things in the report, it proposed after the war the establishment of a national health service, social security, a number of full employment practices, and other similar measures, in all providing its citizens with a base support from the cradle to the grave for the benefit of all of society. So popular was this document that over 600,000 copies of it were sold, and its ideas disseminated, now unprecedented for what was, after all, just a government document on recommendations to help heal and rebuild the nation after the war. In essence, the people of the nation who just had their lives upended for years were seeking some security and a return to normalcy. And this report showed how this could be achieved quite quickly. They'd also just seen what the government could accomplish in war and how working together in this way and focusing money and efforts on the goal produced extraordinary results. So why not spend just a fraction of the money that the war cost on homefront improvements and stability? As one contemporary commentator stated, "We have shown in this war that we British don't always muddle through. We have shown we can organize superbly. Look at these invasions of the continent which have gone like clockwork. Look at the harbors we have built on those beaches. No excuse anymore for unemployment and slums and underfeeding. Using even half the energy and invention and pulling together of what we have done in this war, what is there we cannot do? We have virtually exploded the arguments of old fogies and better-notters who have said we cannot afford this and we must not do that. If we can do it in war, why can't we do it in peace?" Going back to Churchill and the Conservative Party's campaign messages, they didn't just not focus on these very real issues in the nation at the time and vilified the party that was, continued comparing them to Nazis, but also continued to press the message that just because Germany was defeated, the time for sacrifice and fighting abroad was still at hand, with Churchill stating, "5 years ago, I promised you blood, toil, tears, and sweat, and your untiring response brought us, in the end, victory over Germany. Today, we still have tears, not so many, thank God, but the conquest of Japan, hand in hand with our American allies, is a formidable undertaking which we must and will see through to the end." But he didn't just stop with Japan, stating, "And we must still look forward, alas, to blood and sweat. We have a terrific task ahead of us. We have a shattered world around us, and we must help to rebuild it. We must strive for a sane and just peace, which will save us all and our children from that constant fear of war. That is why I am asking today for the support of all men and women of goodwill. During the war, I rested my trust in the British people. Time after time, I warned them of the dangers ahead, and they never failed. Once again, now, today, I must tell you that, in spite of all our victories, a rough road lies ahead. What a shame it would be, and what a folly, to add to our load the bitter quarrels with which the extreme socialists are eager to convulse and exploit these critical years. For the sake of the country and of your own happiness, I call upon you to march with me under the banner of freedom towards the beacon lights of national prosperity and honor, which must ever be our guides." In contrast to a message still focused on sacrifice for matters abroad, Ali stated, "The Parliament of 1935 had a big Conservative majority, and the policy pursued by the Conservative government landed this country into war. It was due to the action of the Labour Party that this Conservative government resigned. Mr. Churchill, who had opposed his own party, formed an all-party government which successfully brought us to victory. Now, a new Parliament must be elected. The choice is between that same Conservative Party, which stands for private enterprise, private profit, and private interests, and the Labour Party, which demands that, in peace, as in war, the interests of the whole people should come before those of a section. Labour puts first things first. Security from war, food, houses, clothing, employment, leisure, and social security for all must come before the claims of the few for more rent, interest, and profit. We have shown that we can organise the resources of the country to win the war. We can do the same in peace." These contrasting messages were, indeed, at the heart of the two campaigns, with the Conservatives using slogans like "finish the job" in contrast to Labour's "let us face the future." On that future, Labour had a very defined plan for fixing the war-torn nation suffering from a massive housing crisis after all the bombings and a number of other extreme issues. Labour was promising to solve all of this, including full employment, in part by nationalising staple industries like coal, steel, railways, electricity, aviation, etc. They also proposed social security, healthcare for everyone, more workers' rights and affordable housing. What's more, once again, given how well they'd done at managing similar things on the home front during the war, the people believed they had the skills to do it. Going back to the Conservatives, while they did propose some things like improved housing and even a national healthcare system, the promises were vague and ill-defined, as well as emphasizing letting the private sector, not the government, figure it out, and otherwise completely drowned out by the rest of their message of focusing abroad. With a nation sick of war and on the verge of bankruptcy, talk of continuation of the war indefinitely wasn't exactly popular as you might imagine. After all, at this point, nobody knew how much longer it would take to defeat Japan. The Allies had more or less defeated Nazi Germany a couple of years before Germany actually was forced to surrender. Further, another line in the Conservatives' campaign was to illustrate the potential threat the Soviets and communism held. On the whole, all of this seemingly giving the impression of a party bent on war indefinitely. And indeed, Churchill was extremely concerned about the Soviets, stating, "Without Germany, what will lie between the white snows of Russia and the white cliffs of Dover?" He also asked his military leaders to devise plans to counter the Soviets should they try to push further into Europe, as well as making plans to ally with Germany and the US against the communist threat. On top of this, as alluded to in Attlee's aforementioned speech, many were angry at the Conservative Party for their policy of appeasement before the war, which ultimately led to the disaster that followed. That Churchill had been leading the charge against such at the time didn't matter. His party was still deemed responsible. Thus, with the Conservative Party's perceived mismanagement of events leading up to World War II versus Attlee and the Labour Party's own extreme successes at managing domestic matters during the war within the coalition government, combined with the Conservative Party as a whole seeming to have no real hard plan that appealed to anyone for how things would be managed after the war, rather than continually pushing the spectre of fear of more wars, all along with the general consensus that the Conservative Party would win in a landslide because of Churchill's popularity, ultimately led to its rather stunning defeat. This is something that should have been easily predicted, even before the election, as polls have been showing for a few years that Labour, not the Conservatives, were leading the popular vote. And in fact, in February of 1945, polls showed that it wasn't even close, with an 18% lead by Labour over the Conservatives. However, as such polls at the time were something of a novelty, few took them very seriously. And so it was. In a landslide victory of 47.7% to Labour and 36% to Conservative, the largest swing from Conservative to Labour in the history of British general elections. Churchill was out, Attlee was in. Perhaps. On this, neither Attlee nor his party had really thought they'd win either, and now that they had, they decided it was critical to give Attlee the boot. Thus, on the very day of victory, they told Attlee to wait to go to the king until they could elect a leader, even though publicly, up to this point, they had been putting Attlee forward as that leader throughout the election. Attlee was having none of it, stating, "You cannot win an election and then say the question of the premiership is open. If you are invited by the king to form a government, you don't say you cannot reply for 48 hours, you accept the commission, and you either bring it off successfully or you don't. And if you don't, you go back and you say you can't and advise the king to send for someone else." His party didn't agree, however, and continued to scheme. Once again, true to his nature, rather than bother to argue further, he simply took action. Unbeknownst to his party, Attlee left and accepted the king's invitation to the palace. Upon returning to his scheming party members' victory party, he told them what he'd done, and the matter mostly dropped from there. As for the meeting with the king, apparently none too pleased with the change, when Attlee arrived, they both at first stood in silence, staring at each other. As things became awkward, Attlee finally broke the silence, stating, "I've won the election." The king then brusquely stated, "I know, I heard it on the 6 o'clock news." What would follow during Attlee's reign were some of the most sweeping changes in British governing history, setting the table for many staples of the government and policy since, such as the National Health Service, expanding the 1944 Education Act, the National Insurance Act, which provides unemployment and sickness benefits, and spearheading building over 1 million new homes in England, Scotland, and Wales in the next 6 years to replace those lost during the war, despite material shortages. Further, with the focus more firmly on the home front rather than matters abroad, Attlee and his government's policies also very intentionally saw the acceleration of the end of the British Empire and decolonisation throughout the world. In all, his brief, only about half a decade run, ultimately defined much of British politics for the next few decades. Now, going back to Churchill, this wasn't his end. You see, while the defeat sent Churchill into one of his occasional depressive spirals, and when the king had offered him the Order of the Garter, he declined, stating that the people had already given him the Order of the Boot. But he ultimately accepted defeat cordially. When his physician quipped that the British people were ungrateful, Churchill reportedly replied, "I wouldn't call it that. They've had a very hard time." He would also state, "They are perfectly entitled to vote as they please. This is democracy. This is what we've been fighting for." And speaking of fighting, Churchill was still the leader of the opposition, and after Attlee and his government had done their thing and relative stability was restored, Churchill and the Conservatives managed to win in 1951, with the then 77 and ailing Churchill nonetheless once again resuming as Prime Minister despite a series of strokes preceding this. During office this time, he particularly focused on continuing to strengthen relations between the US and Britain as the best way to preserve peace in the face of the Soviet rise, as well as to attempt to negotiate an end to the Cold War. On the side, given all his work with the US during his time as leader, in 1963, John F. Kennedy would declare Churchill, by act of Congress, an honorary citizen of the United States, one of only 8 people in history to be given that honor. As for Attlee, he would continue to lead the Labour Party for a handful of years after his time as Prime Minister, before ultimately stepping down at the age of 72 in 1955. He was then elevated to Earl Attlee and took his place in the House of Lords, among other things notably helping to establish the Homosexuality Law Reform Society with the goal of decriminalising homosexual acts. Today, Attlee is almost always listed near the top of greatest prime ministers in UK history, often ahead of Churchill. Of this man, who seemingly everyone had been underestimating his entire career, despite the fact that he'd very quietly somehow managed to rise extremely rapidly from an upper middle class family background to the highest levels of government. Carrots help you see in the dark. Most of us were taught this fact from an early age, presumably in a vain attempt to convince us to eat our vegetables. And on the surface, this makes sense. After all, carrots are rich in beta-carotene and vitamin A, essential to maintaining the health of our retinas and corneas. But while carrots do have real health benefits, the idea that eating a lot of them will magically grant you night vision superpowers is a myth, one with its origins in World War II British propaganda. In September 1940, the German Luftwaffe launched the Blitz, an aerial bombing campaign against London and other southern English cities with the aim of demoralizing the British into ending the war. While the Luftwaffe initially bombed by day, ferocious resistance by RAF Fighter Command forced them to switch to night bombing. And while this should have made the bombers almost impossible to track and shoot down, the British had a secret weapon up their sleeve: radar. The invention of radar came about almost by accident. In 1934, British intelligence began receiving reports that the Germans were developing some kind of death ray, which could use powerful radio waves to stall an enemy bomber's engines or even set it alight at a great distance. A special committee known as the Tizard Commission was established to investigate these claims, and while they found that the power consumption of such a death ray would make it impractical, they also came to another surprising conclusion: that a far more reasonable-sized transmitter could be used to detect and track enemy aircraft long before they reached their target. The task of evaluating this possibility fell to radio expert Robert Watson-Watt and his assistant Arnold Wilkins, who on February 26, 1935, used a prototype radio transmitter to successfully detect an RAF bomber flying over Daventry. The system soon became known as Radio Direction Finding and Arranging, or radar, and just prior to the war, a line of radar towers known as the Chain Home was erected along the Channel coast. These provided valuable information during the Battle of Britain, allowing incoming German bombers to be detected far enough in advance for RAF fighters to be scrambled to intercept them. However, these units were extremely large and operated at relatively long wavelengths, making them all but useless for shooting down aircraft at night. Then in 1940, John Randall and Harry Boot at the University of Birmingham developed the cavity magnetron, a device which allowed the construction of radars light and compact enough to be mounted in aircraft. The first of these units, the Airborne Interception, or AI radar Mark IV, first entered service in early 1941 and allowed British night fighter pilots to find and shoot down German bombers in large numbers. The greatest of these aces, squadron leader John Cat's-Eyes Cunningham, racked up 20 victories before the war's end, 19 of them at night. In order to conceal the secret of radar, the British Ministry of Information launched a campaign of misinformation, attributing the success of pilots like Cunningham to their superior eyesight, gained through eating large amounts of carrots. According to John Stolarczyk of the World Carrot Museum, and yes, there is such a thing, somewhere on the journey, the message that carrots are good for your eyes became disfigured into improving eyesight. But this propaganda wasn't just aimed at the Germans. When the Luftwaffe began bombing by night, the British imposed a total blackout, requiring citizens to keep their lights off or cover their windows with heavy blackout curtains to deny German pilots a means of locating their targets. Inevitably, blackout conditions led to a sharp increase in traffic collisions, with nearly 1,130 Britons dying in nighttime road accidents in the first first year of the war alone. Soon, Ministry of Information posters appeared claiming carrots keep you healthy and help you see in the blackout. Other government departments also got in on the campaign, with the Ministry of Agriculture releasing a statement in December 1940 claiming, if we included a sufficient quantity of carrots in our diet, we should overcome the fairly prevalent malady of blackout blindness. Lord Woolton, head of the Ministry of Food, even coined a catchy saying, "A carrot a day keeps the blackout at bay." This campaign was itself part of a larger effort to change the eating habits of the British public. Being a small island nation, Britain depended on foreign imports for much of its food supply, so at the outbreak of the war, the German Navy launched a campaign of unrestricted submarine warfare against merchant ships in order to starve the British into submission. In response, the British government imposed a system of rationing on food, fuel, and other everyday products. With many staples like butter, meat, and sugar now in short supply, the government encouraged citizens to switch their diet to one richer in vegetables, which they could grow themselves in home victory gardens. The Ministry of Food's Dig for Victory campaign cast home gardening as a patriotic war-winning duty, with Lord Woolton stating, "This is a food war. Every extra row of vegetables in allotment saves shipping. The battle on the kitchen front cannot be won without help from the kitchen garden. Isn't an hour in the garden better than an hour in the queue?" This push for food sustainability led to a greater emphasis being put on the consumption of carrots, which were easy to grow, highly nutritious, and could be used as a mild sweetener in the absence of real sugar. Cartoon characters called Dr. Carrot and Potato Pete were used to promote vegetable consumption, while government pamphlets and radio programs like The Kitchen Front touted a wide assortment of creative and sometimes questionable carrot-based recipes, such as carrot pudding, carrot cake, carrot marmalade, carrot flan, carrot fudge, Walton pie, and even a drink called Carolade. Children were even sold carrots on a stick in place of lollipops, and in case defeating the Nazis wasn't motivation enough to eat your carrots, the government continued to push the notion that a carrot-rich diet would prevent you from being hit by a truck during the blackout. Such was the British obsession with carrots that it even made the news in the United States, with Raymond Daniel, the New York Times London bureau chief, sarcastically remarking, "Lord Woolton, who is trying to wean the British away from cabbage and Brussels sprouts, is plugging carrots. To hear him talk, they contain enough vitamin A to make moles see in a coal mine." But following its entry into the war, America would also jump on the carrot bandwagon, with the New York Times printing British Ministry of Food recipes and articles stating, "England grows a lot of carrots, and it's on them that she largely relies to prevent her people from bumping into lampposts, automobiles, and each other." Even Walt Disney got in on the game, with Disney cartoonist Hank Porter designing a family of cartoon characters based on the British Dr. Carrot, including Carroty George, Pop Carrot, and Clara Carrot, to promote vegetable consumption to the American public. Warner Brothers also made their own contribution in the form of a wisecracking carrot-munching rabbit called Bugs Bunny. These campaigns were so successful that by 1942, Britain found itself with a 100,000-ton surplus of carrots. But what of the original goal of the campaign? To deflect German attention away from the existence of airborne radar. While there are apocryphal stories of the Germans feeding their pilots larger amounts of carrots, most historians agree that they were not fooled by the British propaganda. According to Brian Legate, assistant curator of the RAF Museum in London, "I would say that whilst the Air Ministry were happy to go along with the story, they never set out to use it to fool the Germans. The German intelligence service were well aware of our ground-based radar installation and would not be surprised by the existence of radar in aircraft. In fact, the RAF were able to confirm the existence of German airborne radar simply by fitting commercial radios into a bomber and flying over France to listen to the various radio frequencies." The campaign was far more successful on Allied civilians, with the myth of carrots being good for night vision stubbornly persisting to this day. This is not to say, however, that carrots have no effect on eye health. Far from it. Mild vitamin A deficiency can lead to night blindness, the inability to see in low light, while severe deficiency can lead to a serious degeneration of the retina and cornea. Every year, an estimated 250,000 to 500,000 children go blind from vitamin A deficiency, mostly in poorer countries like Nepal and regions of India, and supplements of beta-carotene and vitamin A have proved effective in reversing much of the damage. However, vitamin A can only restore and maintain eyesight to regular healthy levels. It cannot magically grant you night vision superpowers, and in excessive amounts of vitamin A can actually be toxic, although getting it in the form it comes in carrots and other such vegetable sources will not be harmful to your body, as it won't convert it to vitamin A if it doesn't need it, unlike if you get it from an animal source like liver or an animal-based vitamin A supplement where it's already in that form. Furthermore, studies have shown that carrots are actually relatively inefficient as a source of vitamin A. As alluded to, beta-carotene is converted into vitamin A by E. coli bacteria in the gut, and it takes around 12 to 21 molecules of beta-carotene to produce just 1 molecule of vitamin A. So go ahead, eat as many carrots as you want, but if you really want to see in the dark, and we don't ask why, then might we suggest a pair of night vision goggles? Flight simulators are often an integral part of pilot training, allowing trainees to log hundreds of flying hours and experience in as many emergency scenarios as possible without ever leaving the safety of the grounds. But while modern simulators with their advanced computerized displays and motion simulating hydraulics may seem like a relatively recent development, the idea of replicating the experience of flight on the ground is nearly as old as manned flight itself, with the first mass-produced simulator, the Link Trainer, appearing in the early 1930s. The brainchild of American aviator and inventor Edwin Link, the Link Trainer was a remarkably sophisticated device for its time and was produced and used in the tens of thousands by flying schools, airlines, and air forces around the globe. The Link taught an entire generation of pilots to fly and was one of the forgotten secret weapons that allowed the Allies to attain air superiority and victory in the Second World War. Edwin Albert Link Jr. was born on the 26th of July 1904 in Huntington, Indiana, to Edwin A. Link Sr. and Catherine Martin. In 1910, the family moved to Binghamton, New York State, when Edwin Sr. bought the bankrupt Binghamton Automatic Music Company, a manufacturer of pipe organs and player pianos. Renamed the Link Piano and Organ Company under the Senior Link's management, the company flourished, its products selling well in New York and Pennsylvania, and even as far away as California, competing on equal terms with the more famous Wurlitzer Company. In 1918, the family separated. Catherine moved to Chicago to resume her singing career. Not wanting her youngest son to grow up in the city, she sent Edwin to live with his aunt in Rockford, Illinois. Here, Edwin acquired his lifelong passion for aviation, reportedly after witnessing a troop of barnstormers fly into town. A common sight in rural America in the interwar years, barnstormers were nomadic pilots, many of them First World War veterans who flew from town to town, putting on displays of stunt flying and offering aeroplane rides or even flying lessons to local townsfolk. But while young Edwin was enthralled by their feats of aerial daring-do, his father was less than supportive of his new obsession and pressured him to attend college like his older brother George. But Edwin was firmly drawn to the practical and the mechanical, and instead enrolled in vocational training at Rockford Training High School and then Los Angeles Polytechnic High School. It was in Los Angeles that Edwin took his first flying lessons at a small field run by none other than Sidney Chaplin, brother of legendary movie star Charlie Chaplin. Right from the start, Edwin was less than impressed by the standard training procedure of the time. For the better part of that hour, we did loops and spins and buzzed everything in sight. Thank heaven I didn't get sick, but when we got down, I hadn't touched the controls at all. I thought, that's a hell of a way to teach someone to fly, but I made a date for the next week anyway. I had 2 more lessons with Sidney, and they were pretty much like the first one. He did let me put my hands and feet on the controls during the maneuvers so that I could feel what he was doing. I didn't learn too much, however. I found out later that most of the old-time aviators like Chaplin started teaching their students by scaring them half to death. For Edwin, this was a painfully inefficient way of learning to fly, and an expensive one too, with each lesson typically costing between $25 and $50, which was $300 to $600 today. It would be nearly 6 years before he sat behind the controls of an aeroplane again. At the insistence of his father and older brother, Edwin enrolled at the Lindley Institute Military School in Pennsylvania, but while he enjoyed the military life, he found academic classwork dull, and he soon dropped out, working briefly for the Western Electric Company before landing a job at his father's factory. Over the next few years, he traveled widely on behalf of the Link Company, installing and repairing organs and player pianos in churches, theaters, and music halls across the country. During this time, he also filed his first patent, a small vacuum for cleaning out the air holes in organs and pianos, and befriended a group of barnstormers headed by World War I ace Richard Dick Bennett. In 1926, he finally achieved his dream of flight when fellow pilot Alfred Stanley allowed him to solo in his aircraft. Upon hearing of his son's achievement, Edwin Sr., rather than be impressed and offering to pay for more flying lessons, was instead furious and fired his son on the spot. Thankfully, Edwin Jr. had an ally in George Thayer, the factory superintendent, who, recognizing the younger Link's mechanical talents, threatened to resign if little Edwin wasn't hired back. But by this time, Edwin Jr.'s heart was firmly set on aviation, and in 1928 he borrowed money from his mother to buy his first aircraft, a brand new Cessna Model AA. While ubiquitous today in the world of aviation, in 1928 the Cessna Aircraft Company of Wichita, Kansas had only just been incorporated, and Edwin Link Jr.'s aircraft was the very first one to be delivered. Using this aircraft, Link went into business flying ferry and charter flights and formed his own professional barnstorming troupe. Unlike most of his contemporaries who drank heavily and boasted loudly of their flying abilities and wartime exploits, Link and his crew maintained a sober, professional image, Link later stating, "I wanted to promote aviation, not kill it." Around this time, Link's thoughts returned to the problem of teaching pilots to fly in a safe and affordable manner. He had heard of a system used by the French during the war whereby pilot trainees were introduced to the controls and basic handling of an aircraft by taxiing around on the ground. Known as the Penguin system, the technique dramatically cut down on training time by allowing students to master the basics without the stress and distraction of actual flight. Edwin began to wonder whether a device could be built to simulate the basics of flight while keeping the pilot safely on the ground. While primitive simulators like Sanders' Teacher and Eardley Billing Oscillator had appeared within a few years of the Wright brothers' epoch-making 1903 flight, none had been commercially successful, and in any case, what Link had in mind was far more sophisticated. Working out of the basement of his father's factory, Link spent a year building and perfecting his flight simulator, which he dubbed the Pilot Maker. The device consisted of a small plywood fuselage with stubby wings and a tail containing a cockpit with a full set of controls and instruments. Drawing on Link's intimate knowledge of organs and player pianos, the Pilot Maker was driven by vacuum pressure and pneumatic bellows to make the fuselage climb, dive, roll, and spin just like the real thing. Link immediately proved the device's effectiveness by teaching his brother George to solo after only 6 hours in the simulator and 42 minutes in an actual aircraft. On the 14th of April 1929, Link filed a patent for the Pilot Maker and established a workshop and flight school in the factory basement to build more simulators and use them to train prospective pilots. The revolutionary training course promised to teach students to fly after only 35 hours in the simulator and 2 in an actual aircraft, all for the remarkably low price of $85, which is about $1,300 today. While the pilot school was reasonably successful, with 100 students soloing in its first year of operation, Link found the Pilot Maker itself considerably harder to sell. Though he had hoped that the Army, Air Force, and the Navy would jump at such a useful training device, at first the only buyers were county fairs and amusement parks who, as the November 1930 issue of Science and Invention explained, saw the Pilot Maker as little more than a sophisticated mechanical hobby horse. The device is the center of attention at the Mayfair Miniature Golf Course in Los Angeles, California, where it was first installed. Such devices would make a valuable adjunct to the multitude of miniature golf courses that now dot the country. Though disappointed, Link bowed to market pressure and began manufacturing Pilot Makers specifically for the amusement park crowd, with a built-in coin slot and a scoring dial that removed points every time the rider deviated from a level flight path. But soon, slow sales were the least of Link's problems, as the worsening Great Depression killed demand for organs and player pianos and forced the Link factory to close its doors. Over the next 4 years, Link took on various jobs in order to stay afloat, including aircraft maintenance, stunt flying and parachuting, and even founding one of New York State's first local airlines. Among his most successful schemes involved wiring lights to the bottom of an aircraft's wings to create a giant illuminated flying billboard. But in 1934, a major government scandal would finally give Link the opportunity he had been waiting for and prove the Pilot Maker's true value to the world. In 1920, after several years of experimental flights, the United States Post Office Department established the first regular transcontinental airmail service. At first, the work was contracted out to private companies, but this arrangement soon became marred in scandal. As compensation was based on carrying capacity and not actual mail volume carried, those with stock in the airmail companies began mailing each other lead weights and other heavy objects to pump up revenues. In February 1934, fed up with allegations of corruption and price fixing, the government withdrew the contracts and awarded them to the Army Air Corps, which began a government department that could be more tightly controlled. However, keeping a regular delivery schedule meant flying at night and in inclement weather, and the Army Air Corps had so little experience flying on instruments that a dozen pilots were killed in accidents in the first 5 months of service alone. On February the 10th, Edwin Link received a call from the Army Air Corps asking him to demonstrate the Pilot Maker at Newark Airport the next day. The weather the following morning was grey and foggy. And as the hours ticked past, the Army delegates assembled in the airport hangar began to realize that Link wasn't coming. But then a lone airplane suddenly burst from the fog and made a perfect landing on the runway, and from it stepped Edwin Link, without even having seen the Pilot Maker in action. The delegates concluded that anyone who could make such a landing must know something about flying on instruments, and soon thereafter the Army Air Corps placed an order for 6 trainers at a cost of $3,400, about $66,000 today each. The Link Company was back in business. business. Over the next 4 years, Link would sell hundreds more pilot makers, now simply known as Link trainers, to the Army Air Corps and the Navy, as well as to dozens of private airlines and flight schools. In 1935, Link secured his first international sale to a Keirin company of Japan and was invited to travel to Japan to supervise their installation. The trip was strongly supported by the US government, who wanted Link to report back on Japan's military capabilities. Link arrived in Japan only to discover one of his simulators disassembled and laid out to be photographed. Unable to do anything about it, he nonetheless carried on with the rest of the visit despite knowing that his design would be copied and he would likely never sell another unit in Japan. During the early part of the Second World War, as the United States tried desperately to remain neutral, Link would sell simulators to many other countries who would soon become enemies, including Germany and Italy. By the time America entered the war in 1941, the Link trainer was being used by the air forces of some 35 countries. At this point, the ANT-18, the standard Link trainer used during the Second World War, was not merely a glorified amusement park ride, but rather a sophisticated device for teaching instrument flying. In addition to being able to climb, dive, roll, and spin like an actual aircraft, the Link had a full set of instruments that behaved exactly as they would during flight. Amazingly, just like the Link trainer's movements, much of this simulation was accomplished not with electronics, but rather pneumatics. For example, pushing the control column forward on the back would let air in and out of a metal tank behind the instrument panel. The pressure inside the tank would be read by a pair of modified pressure gauges, which would give simulated values for altitude, airspeed, climb rate, and engine speed. Other instruments, like the artificial horizon and gyro compass, worked exactly as they would in a regular aircraft, while others were slightly modified to work without the G-forces encountered in actual flight. The trainer even featured a cam-powered pneumatic system for simulating turbulence, as well as a mechanism that would throw the student into a spin if they stalled in uncoordinated flight. And to force the student to use his instruments, the Link trainer was fitted with a hinged hood that could be lowered to cut off visibility of the outside world. The effect of all this was so realistic that one Navy trainee, finding himself in a particularly rough situation, reportedly threw open the hood and attempted to bail out, only to break his ankle as he fell to the floor 3 feet below. A short distance away from the Link trainer sat the instructor, seated at a specially designed desk that allowed him to monitor the progress of the student's simulated flight. In addition to a duplicate instrument panel that displayed what the student saw in the cockpit, the desk also featured a small wheeled device called a crab, which rolled along in sync with the student's movements and traced out his flight path in ink on a map. The instructor could also communicate with the student using an intercom system and simulate airport beacons, blind landing systems, and other radio signals using a specialized transmitter. Incidentally, for much more on the inner workings of the Link trainer, I'm going to link to an interesting YouTube video below. In any event, the increasing need for combat aircrew caused production to skyrocket, and Link established a new factory in Gananoque, Canada to keep up with demand. The factory produced nearly 5,000 Link trainers over the course of the war, then at its peak, one Link rolled off the assembly line every 45 minutes. The devices were widely used by the US Army Air Corps, US Navy, and the Royal Canadian Air Force, where they played a pivotal role in the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, a massive undertaking wherein nearly 170,000 British Commonwealth and Empire aircrew, nearly a third of all who served, were sent to Canada to be trained. In total, more than 1 million Allied pilots were trained in the Blue Box, the importance of which in securing Allied air superiority was such that after the war, the RCAF Air Marshal Robert Leckie would declare, "The Luftwaffe met its Waterloo on all the training fields of the free world where there was a battery of Link trainers." After the war, the Link aviation devices would go from strength to strength, developing ever more sophisticated flight simulators, including those used to train the Apollo astronauts to land on the moon. And they are still around today, having been acquired in 2000 by L3 Communications and renamed L3 Link Simulation and Training. As for Edwin Link, in addition to developing simulators, he also became a pioneer in deep-sea diving, developing some of the earliest ocean exploration submersibles and becoming the first diver to breathe a mixture of helium and oxygen underwater, a practice that is commonplace today. He died in Binghamton, New York, on September 7th, 1981, at the age of 77. His creations having taught nearly 3 generations of pilots how to fly. On the 1st of September 1939, nearly 1.5 million troops, 2,750 tanks, and 2,300 aircraft of Adolf Hitler's Third Reich stormed over the border into Poland. We all know what happened next. Despite declaring war in solidarity, Poland's allies, Britain and France, stood by and did nothing as Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union overran and occupied the country in only 5 weeks. What followed was a 7-month period of relative calm known as the Phony War, which was finally broken in the spring of 1940 when the Germans overran Denmark, Norway, France, and the Low Countries in quick succession. Western Europe would remain under German occupation for another 4 years until German defeats on the eastern Western Front and the D-Day landings in Normandy finally turned the tide in favour of the Allies. But this popular narrative of the Second World War is incomplete, for often overlooked is the fact that one of Poland's allies did in fact attempt to intervene early in the conflict. Barely a week after the German invasion, 43 divisions of the French army crossed the border into Germany in an operation that, had it succeeded, might have ended the war before it had even begun. This is the forgotten story of the Saar Offensive, one of the greatest what-ifs in modern military history. Modern Poland was born from the 1919 Treaty of Versailles, in which the victorious Entente powers agreed to reconstitute a Polish state from territories previously occupied by Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia. In the years that followed, the fledgling state fought a series of conflicts in defense of its sovereignty, including the 1920 Polish-Soviet War, in which Polish forces narrowly defeated the Soviet Red Army. Recognizing the nation's vulnerability against its neighbors, in 1921 the Polish government signed treaties with France and Britain, guaranteeing that the latter would defend Poland's sovereignty in case of foreign invasion. When, in early 1939, it became clear that an invasion of Poland was imminent, Poland's allies debated how best to strike a preemptive blow against Germany. First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, suggested floating mines down the Rhine River, but France countered that the Germans would blow up bridges across the Seine in retaliation. The idea of bombing the Black Forest to start uncontrollable fires was also proposed, but this was shot down by Secretary of State for Air Sir Kingsley Wood, who argued that this would constitute an illegal attack against private property. Instead, on May the 19th, Polish Minister of Military Affairs Tadeusz Kasprzycki signed a military convention with Commander-in-Chief of the French Armed Forces, General Maurice Gamelin. The convention stated that as soon as the invasion began, the French would invade Germany from the west in order to divert German forces and relieve pressure on the Polish army. On September the 3rd, 1939, 2 days after the Germans launched their invasion, France and Britain declared war on Germany. French military mobilization, however, had begun considerably earlier on August the 21st. Unfortunately, this process proved painfully slow. One problem was that the French mobilization system itself was woefully antiquated and inefficient, calling for the formation of small cadres of well-trained soldiers who would then train and prepare larger groups of reservists and conscripts for battle. Another problem was what would face the French troops once they crossed the border. The West Wall, or secret line, the formidable line of bunkers, trenches, and other obstacles that defended Germany's western frontier. Generals, as the saying goes, always fight the last war, and French military doctrine in 1939 was heavily mired in First World War era thinking, with a heavy reliance on massed artillery to smash enemy defenses. This was in stark contrast to German blitzkrieg doctrine, which largely replaced heavy artillery with much more mobile ground attack aircraft like the infamous Junkers Ju-87 Stuka. It thus took time for the French to pull these heavy artillery pieces out of storage and move them into position along the border, further slowing the mobilization process. Nonetheless, by the time of the German invasion, the French army had successfully mobilized 40 regular infantry divisions, 3 mechanized divisions, 1 armored division, 40 tank battalions, and 78 artillery regiments under the command of General Gamelin. These were to be further reinforced by 4 infantry divisions of the British Expeditionary Force and the Advanced Striking Force of the Royal Air Force, which began landing in France on September the 4th. On paper, this gave the French an overwhelming numerical advantage over the Germans. With most of its armed forces tied up in Poland, Germany had only 43 highly depleted infantry divisions with which to defend its entire western frontier, a massive front stretching from Denmark to Switzerland. The Saar region, where the French planned to attack, was defended by only 34 divisions under the command of General Erwin von Witzleben, all but 11 of which were composed of poorly trained reservists, mainly armed with World War I-era weapons. Making matters worse, von Witzleben had only recently been recalled from retirement and had only a few hundred armoured vehicles at his disposal, mostly lightly armoured Panzer I and II training tanks. The French, by contrast, fielded one of the best tanks of the period, the Char B, equipped with powerful 47 and 75mm guns and thick armour the German 37mm anti-tank guns could not penetrate. On September the 7th, 1939, 4 days after France's declaration of war, 11 French divisions of the 2nd Army Group, under the command of General André Prételat, crossed the German border along a 32-kilometer front near the town of Saarbrücken. As expected, resistance was almost non-existent, and in a single day, the French advanced 8 kilometers and captured 12 towns with very few losses. By September the 9th, when heavy and mechanized infantry divisions crossed over the border, the French occupied most of the Vent forest and had advanced within a few kilometers of the Siegfried Line. The atmosphere, as the French advanced, was strangely calm, and in many cases surreal. In several towns, French troops encountered hand-painted signs declaring, "French soldiers, we have no quarrel with you. We shall not fire unless you do," or propaganda loudspeaker vans blaring pro-French messages. In many towns, mills and factories continued to operate, while along the border, German and French customs agents chatted casually to each other as if nothing had happened. Indeed, in most areas, the French assault was so leisurely in places that German officials were able to pack up their belongings and retreat ahead of the advancing troops. Yet, despite this promising start, the French assault soon ground to a halt, in part due to the infantrymen's worst enemy, landmines. The fields and forests of the Saar were heavily sown with various anti-tank and anti-personnel mines, including the dreaded S-mine or Bouncing Betty, which we previously covered in our video, The Terrifyingly Effective Non-CD Bollocker. In one town, French troops succeeded in clearing a minefield by driving a herd of pigs through it. One can imagine the resulting carnage did little to improve the soldiers' morale. Another problem plaguing the French army was its poor use of its armored divisions. While the French had excellent tanks, unlike the Germans, they had no cohesive operational doctrine for using them. Thus, instead of supporting the infantry's advance, French tanks were used in showy but redundant assaults on German frontier defenses, while French government VIPs watched from behind the border. And those tanks that did penetrate into Germany quickly discovered that they were of little use, for even without the Siegfried Line, the hilly and heavily forested terrain of the Saar was extremely difficult for vehicles to negotiate. This was completely intentional, the border between France and Germany having been drawn in the wake of the Napoleonic Wars to provide a natural barrier against future French invasions. Worse still, the French quickly discovered that their otherwise excellent Char-B tanks had a fatal weakness. Their engine radiators were mounted on the side of the hull, allowing them to be easily disabled by small arms fire. The heavy artillery around which the French had based their attack also proved inadequate, for a shortage of delay fuses meant that the shells could not penetrate bunkers and pillboxes before detonating, making them all but useless against the Siegfried Line. But the French army's greatest disadvantage was not material or tactical, but psychological. France had suffered greatly during the Great War, losing nearly an entire generation of fighting-age men. This deep national trauma, as well as 2 decades of political turmoil and stagnation, had left the French armed forces poorly organized and highly demoralized, with little appetite for another major conflict. This lack of fighting spirit was evidenced by an incident in which a single machine gun defending a German village held up the French advance for an entire day. All this gave German forces time to regroup and reorganize, and on September the 10th, the German counterattack retook the village of Apache. However, French forces managed to reverse this loss only 2 hours later, and on September the 12th, they captured the town of Brennschelbach for the loss of only 9 men. But the Germans were swiftly gaining strength, and on that same day, the Anglo-French Supreme War Council gathered in Abbeville, France, and decided to hold offensive actions immediately. General Gamelin ordered his troops to hold their ground and not advance closer than 1 kilometer from the Siegfried Line. Shockingly, the Poles were not informed of this decision. Instead, they were merely told that the planned full-scale assault was being postponed from September the 17th to the 20th. Then, on September the 21st, Gamelin ordered a complete withdrawal of French troops from German territory. Several French commanders, including General Henri Girard of the 7th Army, decried the order, arguing that Gamelin was throwing away a massive opportunity. Girard believed that he could capture and consolidate the area between Saarbrücken and Trier, giving France control of the strategically important Kaiserlautern Gap and allowing for future assaults into Western Germany. However, Gamelin ignored Girard's protests, and the withdrawal carried on as ordered. The French withdrawal was nearly as slow and disorganized as the initial advance, such that most of the invading French forces were still in the Saar on October the 6th, the day Polish resistance finally collapsed. The surrender freed up thousands of German troops and hundreds of aircraft, who immediately redeployed to the west to counter the French. Almost immediately, the French Air Force began suffering heavy losses against better equipped and more experienced Luftwaffe pilots, leaving the troops vulnerable to aerial attack. Then, on October the 16th, German troops under General von Witzelben launched a major counteroffensive against the French. Though the French were already in full retreat, they fought a valiant rearguard action and inflicted heavy losses on the Germans. But by the next day, the withdrawal was complete, with all French troops having returned to their starting positions behind the French border. The Saar offensive had been a complete failure, with the French suffering nearly 2,000 killed or wounded against only 200 casualties on the German side. Several German commanders, however, saw the offensive as a close-run thing. At the Nuremberg War Crimes trial in 1946, commander of the army, Generaloberst Alfred Jodl, stated, "If we did not collapse already in the year 1939, that was due only to the fact that during the Polish campaign, the approximately 110 French and British divisions in the West were held completely inactive against the 23 German divisions." Similarly, General Siegfried Westphal stated that had the French pressed home their attack in force, they could have reached the Rhine within 2 weeks, forcing Germany to sue for peace. Such statements inspired the popular notion that the French foolishly threw away a golden opportunity to end the Second World War early, dooming the world to 6 years of the most destructive conflict in modern history. Contemporary historians, however, do dismiss this claim, arguing that the Saar offensive never stood a chance. Though thinly manned at the time of the invasion, the Siegfried Line was still a formidable barrier against which French artillery was all but useless and would have held up the French advance long enough for the German defenders to reorganize and counterattack in force. There was also the matter of air superiority. Even with 90% of its strength tied up in Poland, the Luftwaffe's aircraft and pilots greatly outmatched those of the French Air Force, allowing them to strike at French troops with impunity. And even if the French managed to break through the Siegfried Line and reach the Rhine, their lack of rapid assault doctrine would likely have prevented them from capturing any bridges before they were blown up by the Germans, leaving the invasion stranded on the river's western bank. All of this would have allowed the Germans to hold off on the French for long enough to finish conquering Poland, releasing the troops necessary to beat back the invasion. Thus, while the story of the Saar offensive makes for an intriguing historical what-if, the plain truth is that the French in 1939 were woefully ill-prepared for modern mechanized warfare.
For fashion, even war is no excuse to let standards slip, as many British women found out during World War II. As part of doing their part for king and country, they were strongly encouraged to contribute to the war effort by looking their best at all times. In fact, one bit of British war propaganda was literally "beauty is your duty." As you might imagine, this led to some rather ingenious solutions to solve the inevitable shortages of cosmetics and clothing that arose as a result of wartime rationing. On that note, clothing in the UK began being rationed in June of 1941, about a year after provisions were put in place to ration food. Under the rules of rationing, every person in the UK was initially given 66 coupons, which they could exchange for clothing. Different items of clothing carried different coupon weight, decided by the time and material that went into making them. So, for example, you might need to exchange 11 coupons for a dress, but only 2 for a pair of stockings. Each year, the allocation of coupons would be replenished, though the amount steadily decreased over time, with adults only receiving 24 between September of 1945 and April of 1946. Exceptions to this general rule included children, who were allotted 10 extra coupons to account for rapid growth, and new mothers, who were given 50 extra coupons to buy things like baby clothes and blankets. Again, these amounts changed throughout the war to reflect the ever-growing scarcity of supplies. It's important to point out here that most at this time did not have closets and dressers bursting with clothing as is common today, thanks to a much more industrialized and global clothing industry. Thus, people generally had far fewer garments to begin with, and now even more limited ability to buy replacements. This all led to something called the Make, Do and Mend campaign, which was pushed hard by the British Ministry of Information, demonstrating a variety of ways in which to make clothes last, such as to buy bigger clothing than needed for children so that they had room to grow. They also illustrated techniques aimed towards modifying and repairing clothing using various atypical materials. We're going to get more on this in just a moment. They even set up classes to teach basic seamstress skills, though many women of the era were already pretty good at this. It's also important to note that the public still had to pay for clothes. The coupons were merely exchanged for the right to buy them in the first place. Because of this, the fashion industry not only survived the war, but actually thrived. Even high-end manufacturers, an expensive tailored dress still generally costing the same number of coupons as a cheap one, since they used about the same amount of material. While clothing makers may have seen their volume of civilian sales decrease with the scarcity of supplies and rationing, they simply increased their prices accordingly. And that is not mentioning the fact that making uniforms was actually an extremely lucrative business. Unfortunately for those who couldn't afford the more expensive clothing, this meant either sticking with clothes that were already well worn or using precious coupons on clothing or materials that were low quality and thus didn't last. This all created something of a major problem that needed to be solved pronto if women were to continue looking their best, something deemed important for the country's morale. To solve the issue, the government actually did something somewhat innovative for once, which ultimately would have repercussions on fashion and clothing in the UK for long after the war. They created something that was dubbed utility clothing in 1942. So essentially, this utility clothing was mass-manufactured clothing produced in a limited range of styles, fashions, and colors to minimize production costs over how clothing up until that point was commonly made in the UK. Importantly, beyond driving the costs down, a second goal of this fashion line was to make the clothing extremely durable. With clothing lasting longer for everyone, this also ensured more materials, factories, and workers in the future would be available for the war effort instead of making clothing for civilians. But making cheap and durable wasn't enough. After all, the overarching goal was for women particularly to look good. Thus, the government actually managed a trifecta by enlisting the aid of the Incorporated Society of London Fashion Designers to provide the nation's best in the field to oversee the designs for both men and women's utility clothing. Because of this, utility clothing actually became something of a hit with the public in the UK, and many of the designs would probably still be considered fashionable today because of things like conservative dark suits, tapered dresses, and black plimsolls, which never really go out of style. In fact, bizarrely, they even made a relatively fashionable air raid outfit known as a siren suit. This meant that if a woman needed to jump out of bed and flee to a bomb shelter while possibly literally having bombs fall all around her, she would look very good while running for her life. So with clothing sort of out of the way, this brings us to the makeup side of things. Unlike most everything else during World War II, makeup and cosmetics were never rationed during the war. Instead, they were subjected to a massive luxury tax, which was levied upon items deemed non-essential by the government. Of course, as that same government was very publicly pushing women to, quote, look your best at all times, many of the fairer sex didn't consider these items non-essential. Unsurprisingly, big cosmetic companies weren't exactly helping either, going as far as to pay for large ads in the papers and magazines informing women that, again, we're quoting here, no lipstick, ours or anyone else's, will win the war, but it symbolizes one of the reasons why we are fighting. On this note, amusingly, the cosmetic brands continued to put out adverts despite the fact that the stock of the very things they were advertising for were low to non-existent. Well, that might make you wonder, well, why did they do this? Well, in essence, it's generally thought that they were afraid that if women got used to not wearing makeup, that when the war was over, some simply might not go back to it. So the companies did everything in their power to push women to continue to find ways to wear some form of makeup. Paradoxically, this meant they continued to advertise a product that was impossible for many women to obtain, right next to full-page ads telling them that if they didn't wear it, they were essentially letting Hitler win. Oh, and we are not using hyperbole here, by the way. It was well known at the time that Adolf had a particular distaste for makeup and cosmetics, with the Führer even known to chastise women for wearing perfume or using hair dye. In fact, when Hitler came to power, he established a German fashion board to help push his brand of fashion, emphasizing, among other things, no makeup, natural hair, and curves, rather than, to quote, the boyish bodies that Parisian fashion promoted. Important to the discussion at hand was the end goal here. According to Hitler, this was that Berlin women must become the best dressed in Europe. So what was a patriotic, Nazi-hating British woman about town to do when she wanted to stick it to Hitler but didn't have the coupons or money to afford a new dress and nobody in town had any cosmetics? Well, in short, she improvised. Women would make new clothing out of everything from curtains to furniture upholstery to old parachutes, and they would raid their wardrobes to reuse, mend, and alter their existing outfits to make them more stylish. The lack of materials also allowed women to be a little more risque in their clothing choices, and the hemlines of dresses became noticeably shorter during the war as a result of this. This, however, caused a problem of another sort, and that was exposed bare skin. This is because there was no really good way to cover it, with a shortage of stockings and the relatively newly invented nylon being unavailable to most due to being exclusively used by the military. To get around this problem, women actually began staining their legs with various things, including gravy browning, to make it look as though they were wearing something. Some even went so far as drawing a seam down the back of their legs to complete the effect. Well, with the government seeing to it that every government poster recruiting a land girl, image of a wren, or member of the Women's Royal Voluntary Service showed her with bright red lipstick and a flash of black mascara, the clothing problem wasn't the only thing that needed to be solved. To get around the lack of lipstick, lipstick, women would dye their lips with beetroot and, somewhat questionably from a health standpoint, use boot polish as a makeshift mascara. They would also shove flowers and other herbs into their pockets to get around the lack of perfume. Also, some girls working in certain factories also notably used the powder meant to protect their face from heat as rouge, and would sometimes speckle their hair in TNT powder to dye it blonde. Do note here that when it was first made in the mid-19th century, TNT was actually originally used not as an explosive, but as a yellow dye. On that note, some women couldn't help but go yellow, specifically those working in munitions factories. They eventually got the nickname Canary Girls because the powdered explosive, whether they wanted it to or not, would dye their skin and hair bright yellow. The color eventually faded, but the powder caused horrible skin rashes and breathing problems. Oh, and we should also probably note here that prolonged exposure to TNT can cause liver, blood, spleen, and immune system problems, among many others. But hey, when beauty is your duty, you know what you have to do. You can't let those German women look better than you. Then Hitler would win. If you take a peek at a list of pilots who were considered flying aces during World War II, you'll notice that the top of the list is dominated by Luftwaffe pilots, some of whom scored hundreds of aerial victories during the war. While their skill and prowess in the air is undeniable, it's arguable that the finest display in aerial combat during World War II was achieved, mostly by luck, by an American B-24 co-pilot when he scored a single enemy kill with nothing but a handgun at about 4,000 to 5,000 feet, that's 1.3 kilometers in altitude, and without a plane. This is the story of Owen Baggett. Born in 1920 in Texas, after finishing high school, Baggett moved to the city of Abilene to enroll in Hardin-Simmons University. While we were unable to discern what Baggett studied from the sparse amount of information available about his early life, the fact that he went to work at Johnson & Company Investment Securities in New York after graduating suggests he studied finance, business, or another similar subject. Whatever the case, while still working at the investment firm in New York in December of 1941, Baggett volunteered for the Army Air Corps and reported for basic pilot training at the New Columbus Army Flying School. After graduating from basic training, Baggett reported for duty in India, just a stone's throw away from Japanese-occupied Burma with the 10th Air Force. Baggett eventually became a co-pilot for a B-24 bomber in the 7th Bomb Group based in Pandaveswar and reached the rank of second lieutenant. During his time with the 7th Bomb Group, Baggett's duties mainly consisted of flying bomb runs into Burma and helping defend Allied supply routes between India and China. Baggett's career was mostly uneventful, or at least as uneventful as it could be given the circumstances, for around a year, until he was called upon to take part in a bombing run on the 31st of March 1943. The mission itself was fairly simple. Baggett and the rest of the 7th Bomb Group were to fly into Burma and destroy a small but vital railroad bridge near the logging town of Pyongyang. However, shortly after taking off, the unescorted bombers of the 7th Group were attacked by a few dozen Japanese Zero fighters. During the ensuing dogfight, the plane's emergency oxygen tanks were hit, severely damaging the craft. Ultimately, First Lieutenant Lloyd Jensen gave the order for the crew to bail out. Baggett relayed the order to the crew using hand signals, since their intercom had also been destroyed, and leapt from the aircraft with the rest of the surviving crew. Not long after the crew bailed out, the attacking Japanese Zeros began training their guns on the now defenseless crewmen, lazily floating towards the ground. Baggett would later recall seeing some of his crewmates being torn to pieces by gunfire. In total, 5 of the 9 aboard the downed bomber were killed. As for himself, a bullet grazed his arm, but he was otherwise fine. In a desperate bid to stay that way, after being shot in the arm, Baggett played possum, hanging limp in his parachute's harness. According to a 1996 article published in Air Force magazine, this is when Baggett spotted an enemy pilot lazily flying along almost vertically in mid-air to come to check out whether Baggett was dead or not, including having his canopy open to get a better look at Baggett. When the near-stalling plane came within range, Baggett ceased to play dead and pulled out his M1911 from his holster and aimed it at the pilot, squeezing the trigger 4 times. The plane soon stalled out, and Baggett didn't notice what happened after, thinking little of the incident, being more concerned with the other fighters taking potshots at he and his crew. After safely reaching the ground, Baggett regrouped with Lieutenant Jensen and one of the bomber's surviving gunners. Shortly thereafter, all 3 were captured, at which point Baggett soon found himself being interrogated. After telling the events leading up to his capture to Major General Aramura, commander of the Southeast Asia POW camps, very oddly, as no one else in his little group was given the opportunity, Bagot was given the chance to die with honor by committing harikiri, an offer he refused. Later, while still a POW, Bagot had a chance encounter with one Colonel Harry Melton. Melton informed him that the plane that Bagot had shot at had crashed directly after stalling out near him, and supposedly the pilot's body had been thrown from the wreckage. When it was recovered, he appeared to have been killed, or at least seriously injured via having been shot, at least according to Colonel Melton. Despite the fact that the plane had crashed after his encounter with it, Bagot was still skeptical that one or more of his shots actually landed, and figured that something else must have happened to cause the crash. Nevertheless, it was speculated by his compatriots that this must have been the reason Bagot alone had been given the chance to die with honor by committing harikiri after being interrogated. Bagot never really talked about his impressive feat after the fact, remaining skeptical that he'd scored such a lucky shot. He uneventfully served the rest of his time in the war as a POW, dropping from a hearty 180 pounds and change to just over 90 pounds during the near 2 years he was kept prisoner. The camp he was in was finally liberated on September 7, 1945 by the OSS, and he continued to serve in the military for several years after World War II, reaching the rank of colonel. The full details of his lucky shot were only dug up in 1996 by John L. Frisbee of Air Force magazine. After combing the records looking to verify or disprove the tale, it turned out that while Colonel Harry Melton's assertion that the pilot in question had been found with a .45 caliber bullet wound could not be verified by any documented evidence, it was ultimately determined that Bagot must have managed to hit the pilot. You see, the plane in question appears to have stalled at approximately 4,000 to 5,000 feet, so an amazing amount of time for the pilot to have recovered from the stall had he been physically able, and based on official mission reports by survivors, there were no Allied fighters in the vicinity to have downed the fighter, and no references of anyone seeing any friendly fire at the slow-moving plane before its ultimate demise. Further, even with some sort of random engine failure, the pilot should still have had some control of the plane instead of reportedly more or less heading straight down and crashing after the stall.
During the Second World War, more than 260,000 Allied personnel were captured by the Western Axis powers and held in prisoner of war camps in Germany, Italy, and their occupied territories. Their bold and often ingenious escape attempts have become the stuff of legend, including the famous Great Escape from the Stalag Luft III camp in March of 1944, and countless outlandish breakouts from the infamous Colditz Castle. And for more on that, please see our video that time Allied POWs secretly built an airplane from scratch to escape a Nazi compound. It's an incredible story. Less well remembered are the some 400,000 German and Italian prisoners of war interned in Britain, Canada, and the United States. Their ingenuity and will to escape was no less than that of their Allied counterparts, but while some 1,500 Allied POWs succeeded in making the home run back to friendly or neutral territory, over the entire course of the war, only one Axis prisoner managed to escape Canadian Allied captivity and make it all the way back home to Germany. This is the extraordinary story of Lieutenant Franz von Vera. Franz von Vera was born on July 13, 1914 in the Swiss village of Luc Tirosoli and Leo Freiherr von Vera, destitute German aristocrats. Franz von Vera joined the German Air Force, or Luftwaffe, in 1936 and was commissioned as a lieutenant in 1938. He was by all accounts the epitome of the Aryan Superman celebrated by Nazi propaganda, with blue eyes and wavy blonde hair, though Luftwaffe Chief Hermann Goering would later note his unusually short stature. He played up the image of a dashing fighter pilot driving fast sports cars and giving a pet lion cub named Simba as a squadron mascot, while his habit of wearing a red jacket into combat led German tabloids to dub him the Red Devil, terror of the British Air Force. Though many of his colleagues saw him as arrogant and a braggart, fellow POW Heinz Kramer would later describe him as an honest and pleasant young man, a bit of a showman with a wonderful imagination, but a reliable and honest chap. Von Vera first saw combat during the Battle of France as part of Jagdgeschwader 3, shooting down his first aircraft, a British Hawker Hurricane, on May 20th, 1940. He followed this 2 days later by shooting down 3 French bombers. During the subsequent Battle of Britain on a single day, August 25th, 1940, Von Vera claimed to have shot down 1 Spitfire and 3 Hurricanes and destroyed a further 5 aircraft on the ground, bringing his total kills to 13 and officially making him an ace. While only a few of these victories were ever officially confirmed, the German state media saw the propaganda value of Von Vera's exploits, and his claims were never contested. On September 5th, 1940, Von Vera was escorting a bomber squadron over Kent when his Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighter was shot down by Spitfires flown by Flight Lieutenant Patterson Hughes and pilot officer Gerald Stapleton of 234 Squadron RAF. Von Vera managed to crash land a stricken aircraft in a field on Love's Farm near Winchett Hill and was quickly arrested by a cook from a nearby army unit. He was taken to the nearby village of Maidstone and held overnight in the local constabulary before being transferred to Maidstone Barracks under the guard of the Queen's Own Royal West Kent Regiment. It is here that he made his first escape attempt, overpowering his guard while digging in the garden with a pickaxe. He was quickly recaptured and sent to the infamous Cockfoster's Cage, an MI9 interrogation centre at Trent Park in Hertfordshire. Here he was held and interrogated for 18 days but failed to divulge any useful information. At one point, in typical cocksure fashion, Von Vera bet his interrogator, one Squadron Leader Hawks, that the British wouldn't be able to hold him for 6 months. Neither man could have known at the time how right Von Vera was. Following his stay at the Cage, Von Vera was transferred to POW Camp No. 1 in Furness Fells, Lancashire, where he immediately set about planning his next escape attempt. On the afternoon of October 7th, 1940, while the prisoners were out on a guarded walk in the countryside, Von Vera took advantage of a distraction created by an approaching fruit cart to roll over a low stone wall and slip away. His absence was not noticed until later that evening, whereupon local police forces and the Home Guard were alerted to the presence of an escaped German officer in the area. Von Vera, travelling mainly by night, managed to evade capture for 3 days until on the night of October 10th he was discovered by the Home Guard sheltering from the rain in a hogarth, a small stone structure used to store animal feed. The guardsmen bound Von Vera's hands behind his back and began leading him back to the nearest town, but Von Vera managed to slip his bonds, break the guardsman's lantern, and escape into the darkness. It was another 2 days before he was finally recaptured while attempting to hide in a bog submerged up to his neck. After serving 21 days solitary confinement at Furness Falls on November 3rd, Von Vera was transferred to Camp No. 13 at Swanwick, Derbyshire. Here he befriended a group of prisoners, including Lieutenant Walter Manhard and Major Heinz Kramer, who formed an escape committee they jokingly called Swanwick Tiefbau AG, or Swanwick Digging Company Incorporated. While progress on their escape tunnel was swift due to the sturdy clay soil, the group soon began running out of room to hide all the excavated soil. This stalled construction for weeks until Manhard discovered a large rainwater cistern beneath the garden house which could hold double the expected volume of soil. On December 17th, 1940, the tunnel was at last complete. On the night of the 20th, under the cover of a nearby air raid and the camp choir, Von Vera, Manhard, and Kramer crawled through the tunnel and out into the surrounding countryside. Amusingly, the song chosen to cover their escape was I Must Away into the Great Wide World. While the men's absence was not noticed until the following afternoon, Kramer and Manhard were quickly spotted and recaptured, leaving Von Vera on his own. Thankfully, he had prepared a convincing disguise. Thousands of aircrew from occupied Allied nations such as Poland, Norway, and the Netherlands served in the RAF, so a man in British uniform with a foreign accent did not attract undue suspicion. Dressed in a homemade RAF uniform with forged identity papers, Von Vera planned to pass himself off as Captain von Lott, a Dutch bomber pilot whose aircraft had crashed returning from a mission. Knowing that bombers flew at night, he waited until 3 a.m. before approaching a friendly locomotive driver and asked to be taken to the nearest RAF airfield. At Cardinal Park railway station, Von Vera came under the suspicion of the local railway clerk and police constable, but he managed to convince them of his identity, and they secured his passage to RAF Hucknall in Nottingham. At Hucknall, when the squadron leaders asked for his credentials, Von Vera claimed to be based at Dice near Aberdeen in Scotland. While the squadron leader rang there to confirm his story, he asked Von Vera for his identity disc. To his horror, Von Vera realized that his fake disc had melted due to his body heat, and he hastily excused himself to use the lavatory. Running across the airfield, he spotted a Hawker Hurricane fighter being readied and informed the mechanic that he was taking it on a test flight. Von Vera was already strapped into the cockpit trying to figure out the controls when the squadron leader ran up with his service revolver to arrest him. Britain. Amazingly, this would not be the closest a German prisoner would come to escaping Britain by aircraft. On November 24, 1941, Lieutenants Hans Schnabel and Harry Wappler escaped from a POW camp in Penrith, Cumbria, and made their way to nearby RAF Kingston Airfield, where they managed to commandeer a Mars Magister training aircraft and get airborne. However, lack of fuel and freezing temperatures forced them to turn back and land near the coast, where they were soon captured. In Fonfara's case, it became clear that the British Isles could no longer contain the slippery pilot, so on January 10, 1941, Fonfara and 1,000 other German prisoners were placed on board the ocean liner SS Duchess of York to be sent to internment camps in Canada. Fonfara, who was by now a known escape risk, was placed in his own cabin under special guard, yet he still continued to plot his escape. During the crossing, Fonfara managed to befriend the ship's galley crew, offering to peel potatoes and carry out other menial tasks. Slowly but surely, he gained the trust of more and more of the crew and began to penetrate normally forbidden areas of the ship, getting as far as the engine room without being stopped. Knowing that the convoy they were sailing with was bound for North Africa and would soon depart, Fonfara and his fellow passengers plotted to take over the ship and sail her back to an occupied French port. Unfortunately for them, on the day the convoy departed, the Germans discovered to their dismay that one escort, the British battleship HMS Ramillies, had remained to shepherd them all the way to Canada. Duchess of York arrived safely in Halifax, Nova Scotia, where the prisoners were transferred to a train bound for a POW camp on the north shore of Lake Superior. After the abortive mutiny, Fonfara had decided to escape to the United States, which at the time was still neutral. While the nearest border crossing was between New Brunswick and Maine, Fonfara decided to save his attempt until late in the train journey, when it would least be expected. This would take place between Montreal and Ottawa, where the rail line came closest to the St. Lawrence River on the US-Canada border. On the 21st of January 1941, near Smiths Falls, Ontario, Fonfara put his plan into action. The train windows had all frozen shut in the winter cold, forcing the prisoners to turn up the car heaters to free them. At a prearranged signal, a fellow passenger raised a blanket as if folding it, shielding Fonfara and 7 other prisoners from view as they crawled through the open windows and plunged headfirst into the snow below. Amazingly, none of the guards noticed the escape, and the windows quickly frosted over again, blocking the escapees from view. The train was nearly 100 miles away by the time their absence was noticed. Once again, all of Fonfara's fellow escapees were quickly recaptured, leaving him on his own. Freezing due to a lack of proper winter clothes, Fonfara stumbled upon a nearby road, hoping to bum a ride to the border. A car soon approached, but as it drew closer, Fonfara realized it was a police car and quickly dropped his hand. But it was too late. The car came to a stop. Believing he had been caught, Fonfara grudgingly approached the car, only to be informed that hitchhiking had recently been outlawed in Canada and that he had barely avoided being arrested. Nonetheless, the policeman offered him a ride and dropped him off in Johnstown, just across from the St. Lawrence from Ogdenburg, New York. Seeing that the river was frozen, Fonfara attempted to cross on foot, but found a wide, ice-free channel blocking his path. Doubling back, he wandered through the night until he stumbled upon an abandoned summer camp near the town of Prescott, where he found an overturned wooden boat. Despite his hands being nearly frozen, using fence paling as a shovel, he managed to dig the boat out of the snow, drag it across the ice, and cross the river. Once in Ogdensburg, Fonfara turned himself into the police, who passed him off to the Board of Immigration. Charged with illegally entering the country, Fonfara contacted the German consul in New York City, who paid his bail and arranged for a local attorney, James Davies, to represent him. Fonfara was released and instructed to appear before a grand jury in Albany a week later. Fonfara's arrival in the United States caused a sensation, and he was treated like a celebrity by the media and otherwise saw the sights and lived the high life in New York City. He also took to writing Wish You Were Here postcards to old friends and comrades, including Squadron Leader Boniface from Hucknall Airfield and Squadron Leader Hawk from Cockfosters Cage Interrogation Center. During this time, he also learned that Adolf Hitler had awarded him the prestigious Knight's Cross for his August 25th attack on an RAF airfield, an attack most historians now agree never took place. But Fonfara did not have long to relax, for the Commonwealth authorities were hot on his trail. Soon after his border crossing, the Ontario Provincial Police delivered a summons to the Ogdensburg Police, charging Fonfara with the theft of a rowboat worth $35. This tiny sum was widely mocked in the German press, the German embassy even issuing a statement reading, "In view of the great importance Canada appears to attach to the boat, Franz Fonfara will gladly place at the disposal of the American authorities the sum of $35 so that the warrant against him may be withdrawn." However, given the criminal nature of the charge, it could not be tried in an American court and could have led to Fonfara's extradition back to Canada. The German consul therefore decided to get Fonfara out of the United States as quickly as possible. In April 1941, while negotiations between the American and Canadian governments raged on, von Vera boarded a train out of New York and slipped across the border into Mexico. From here, the various German consuls in South America shuttled von Vera along a circuitous route through Brazil, Bolivia, and Peru, and finally across the Atlantic to Barcelona and Rome. Franz von Vera finally reached Germany on April 18, 1941, 225 days after he had been captured. In Germany, von Vera was hailed as a hero, with Hitler personally congratulating him for his courage and ingenuity and ability to turn a tactically unfavorable situation to his own advantage. But even more valuable than von Vera's heroic status were his unique insights into British interrogation techniques. Drawing from his experiences at the Cockfosters cage, von Vera wrote a pamphlet titled How to Behave If Taken Prisoner, which remained in use until 1944 and effectively cut off one of MI9's most valuable sources of intelligence. He also consulted on improvements to German interrogation techniques and contradicted the portrayal of British POW camps in Nazi propaganda, stating, "Generally speaking, British treatment of German war prisoners is unexceptional. Such isolated instances of maltreatment as have occurred have resulted from wrong behavior on the part of the prisoners concerned in the first decisive moments of captivity." In any event, in recognition for his daring escape, von Vera was promoted to Hauptmann and made a commander of the squadron JG-52 on the Eastern Front. In July 1941, he scored 13 more victories against Russian aircraft, bringing his total kills to 21. In August, his squadron was recalled to Germany to be equipped with new aircraft and reposted to Katwijk in the Netherlands. Then, a mere 8 months after arriving back in Germany, Franz von Vera's luck finally ran out. On October 25, 1941, von Vera was on a routine training flight off the Dutch coast when he experienced engine failure and crashed into the sea north of Vlissingen. His body was never recovered. Franz von Vera's extraordinary globe-spanning odyssey from captivity to freedom is emblematic of the determination and fighting spirit displayed by all servicemen during the Second World War and the effectiveness of interning Axis prisoners in Canada. Indeed, with the possible exception of U-boat sailor Walter Reich, who claimed to have escaped from a troopship in the St. Lawrence in July of 1940, von Vera remains the only German POW to make it all the way from Canada to Germany during the entirety of the war. His story was popularized in a 1956 book by Kendall Burt and James Leeser, and a 1957 film starring Hardy Kruger, both titled after von Vera's now immortal nickname, The One That Got Away. Hermann Göring was second only to Hitler in the hierarchy of the Third Reich. Commander of the Luftwaffe, acting Prime Minister of Prussia, President of the Reichstag, and Hitler's designated successor, Göring's Nazi resume was almost unparalleled. Born in Bavaria in 1893, Göring was the son of a professional soldier and governor in West Africa. He followed his father's footsteps and joined the military in 1912. He served in the Luftwaffe during World War I and took over the command of the Red Baron Manfred von Richtenhafen's old squadron. Although he won several awards for bravery and his numerous victories, Göring wasn't popular with the other pilots, seemingly due to his arrogance. After joining the fledgling Nazi Party in 1922, Göring quickly became indispensable and was instrumental in the Nazi takeover of the German government. After Hitler became Chancellor, he appointed Göring as Prussian Minister for the Interior, Commissioner for Aviation, and Commander-in-Chief of the Prussian Police and Gestapo. Göring never hesitated to enjoy the perks of his exalted position. He had a magnificent palace in Berlin, as well as a luxurious hunting lodge named in honor of his late wife Karen, who died in 1931. He loved to play dress-up and would change his uniforms several times a day, proudly displaying all of his medals. It was joked among the press at the time that he probably bathed in his uniform. Despite Göring's own godfather, Dr. Hermann Epstein Ritter von Mattenberg, having been an exceptionally successful businessman of Jewish ancestry and a man who his mother had a long-lasting open affair with his elderly father turning a blind eye to it and allowing his young wife to live with Epstein, Göring was an advocate of the elimination of the Jews from the German economy and infamously ordered the architect of the Holocaust, Reinhard Heydrich, to carry out all preparations with regard to a general solution of the Jewish question in those territories of Europe which are under German influence. In 1939, Göring had serious reservations about his Luftwaffe being ready to face the Royal Air Force in battle, but Hitler pushed for the acceleration of the war plans, and the war began anyway. At this point, Göring was at the peak of his power and popularity, and Hitler trusted him implicitly. But despite many early victories, the Germans couldn't maintain their momentum. As Germany's fortunes grew dimmer, Goering standing with Hitler and the German people, it began to falter. At a time when most Germans were living hand-to-mouth, Goering's lifestyle of extreme excess was, let's say, no longer admired. His tendency to make bold claims to Hitler and not produce results also didn't put him in good stead with Hitler either. The final straw was on April 23rd, 1945, when Berlin was close to falling, and Goering, who had been declared by Hitler to be his successor if anything should happen to him, met with other officials and decided to take over as Hitler was trapped in Berlin. Hitler would commit suicide just a week later. When Goering officially requested Hitler approve his decision, Hitler was furious and charged Goering with treason. He then ordered Goering's arrest and stripped him of his rank and membership in the Nazi Party. When Goering surrendered to the Allies in Austria on May 8, 1945, he did it, at least in theory, as a civilian. To his apparent surprise, Goering was put on trial for war crimes at Nuremberg. During his trial, according to American intelligence officer and psychologist Captain Gustav Gilbert, when he interviewed him, Goering was defensive and deflated and not very happy over the turn the trial was taking. He said that he had no control over the actions or the defense of the others, and that he had never been anti-Semitic himself, had not believed these atrocities, and that several Jews had offered to testify on his behalf. Despite being deflated, Goering defended himself with great vigor and skill, putting his vaunted 138 IQ to work. It was tested while he was in custody during the trial. Occasionally, he managed to outwit the prosecution. After watching the films that documented the atrocities committed in the concentration camps, Goering claimed he was shocked at what was depicted and felt that the films had to have been faked somehow. Unsurprisingly, given he was second only to Hitler and the Nazi Party, nobody believed for a second that Goering hadn't known what was happening in the camps. In the end, Goering was found guilty on all 4 counts: conspiracy to wage war, crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The judgment read, "There is nothing to be said in mitigation, for Goering was often, indeed almost always, the moving force, second only to his leader. He was the leading war aggressor, both as political and as military leader. He was the director of the slave labor program and the creator of the oppressive program against the Jews and other races at home and abroad. All these crimes he has frankly admitted. On some specific cases, there may be conflict of testimony, but in terms of the broad outline, his own admissions are more than sufficiently wide to be conclusive of his guilt. His guilt is unique in its enormity. The record discloses no excuses for this man." Hermann Goering was sentenced to die by hanging, but requested that he be given a soldier's death by firing squad. The court, though, they insisted that he be executed like any common criminal. Neither side got exactly what they wanted, but Goering still ended up just as dead when he ingested a cyanide tablet on October 15th, 1946, mere hours before his date with the hangman. Unlike Hermann, his little brother Albert was a bit of a legend. He despised the Nazi Party and did just about everything in his power to oppose them, frequently getting himself arrested, but getting off each time due to who his older brother was, and occasionally via direct intervention from Hermann. According to the book 34 by William Burke, Albert's first known open act to help the Jews was a small one. While in Vienna, he happened upon a group of Jewish women who had a vicious mob around them and were being forced to scrub the streets. When he saw this, he simply walked up to one of the women, asked for a scrub brush from her, and knelt down and began scrubbing the street as well. This didn't sit well with the officers who were overseeing the whole thing, but when they realized who Albert's brother was, they quickly ordered the scrubbing to stop and the mob to disperse. In a similar incident, this one which resulted in his own arrest, he came upon a small mob that was harassing an elderly Jewish woman, putting a sign around her neck that stated, "I am a Jewish sow." Albert pushed his way through the crowd around her and helped the woman to escape the little mob. In the process of doing so, he had to physically attack 2 members of the Gestapo, for which he was ultimately arrested. As before, once they realized who they'd arrested, he was set free. More significantly, Albert is thought to have helped numerous Jewish people by helping fund an underground movement that helped Jews escape to freedom. He also forged his brother's signature on several occasions to get Jews and others released from concentration camps and prisons. Other times, he'd simply convince Hermann to sign an order to let certain people go, playing on his brother's vanity and love for displaying his power. In his most daring act, he drove up to a concentration camp and simply demanded that he be given Jews for labor for the company Skoda Works, where Albert worked at the time. Normally, as he had no official papers for such a request, he would have been turned away, but because of who his brother was, his request was granted. After loading his truck with as many Jews as he could, he dropped them off in a remote area and let them go with instructions on their best route to freedom. After that, though, the gig was up and an order was sent from Berlin to have him shot. He managed to escape to a safe house, however, and the war ended very soon after. Despite his actions during the war, upon presenting himself to Allied soldiers, he was promptly arrested. Unlike his older brother, Albert was acquitted during the Nuremberg trials, though not before spending around a year and a half in prison, with no one believing him that he had actually spent the war actively working against the Nazis and helping as many people as he could escape their clutches. In fact, when he first told his story after being arrested, Major Paul Kabala noted in Albert's file, "The results of the interrogation of Albert Goering constitute as clever a piece of whitewash as we have ever seen." However, Albert finally did find someone willing to listen in Major Victor Parker. He had given Parker a list of 34 Jews he knew the names of that he had personally helped escape. Again, according to the book 34, by an extraordinary coincidence, one of the Jews on this list was Major Parker's uncle. After verifying the claim with his uncle, he pursued the other names on the list, who all testified in Albert's defense, and he was finally set free. Unfortunately, after the war, he found himself largely shunned due to his association with his brother and that few knew of Albert's real activities during the war. As a result, he struggled to find work for the remainder of his life and ultimately became an alcoholic. As his health began to fail and death was imminent in 1966, he was dying of pancreatic cancer, Albert decided to marry his housekeeper. This was not out of love, but simply because by doing so, she would then be entitled to his government pension, making sure she would be taken care of financially after her services as his housekeeper were no longer required. He died a week later, in December 1966. And now for a bonus fact. Due to Albert's strong resemblance to his aforementioned godfather, Dr. Hermann Epstein, the fact that it was shortly after Albert's birth that Epstein declared that he was going to be the godfather to all Albert's mother's children, the fact that Albert's sister claimed Albert was Epstein's favorite, and that the affair between Epstein and Albert's mother started well before Albert's birth, it is rumored that Albert was actually the son of Dr. Epstein. However, this is generally discounted by most historians because the dates just barely don't line up, given a lengthy trip Albert's mother took to Haiti, ending in mid-1894. For reference, Albert was born on March the 9th, 1895.
The attack came without warning. One day in early December, American sailors looked to the sky in terror as enemy aircraft came screaming down towards them. As bombs rained down and exploded all around them, the sailors scrambled to their guns and fired desperately at the dive-bombing aircraft, which swooped so low the gunners could see the pilots' faces, along with a bright red disc painted on its wings. After barely 30 minutes, it was all over, with 4 sailors and passengers dead, 48 wounded, and the vessel beginning to sink. And so it was the commander gave the order to abandon ship. If you think you've heard this story already, think again, for this scene did not play out on December 7th, 1941, but on December 12th, 1937, and this action took place not in the sleepy tropical paradise of Hawaii, but on the turbulent, muddy waters of China's Yangtze River during a conflict all but forgotten today. This is the story of the USS Panay incident, the surprise Japanese attack that almost dragged America into the war 4 years earlier. The USS Panay was the lead vessel of the Panay class, a family of river gunboats specially designed for service on the Yangtze and its tributaries. Western gunboats had been a constant presence on Chinese rivers since the Opium Wars of 1839 and 1856, when the British forced the Chinese to sign a series of so-called unequal treaties opening the country to foreign trade. Businessmen and missionaries from all around the world flooded into China's interior, with dozens of trading ports, settlements, and missions popping up all along the coast and the banks of the Yangtze. But as the power of the ruling Qin dynasty began to crumble, these foreign settlements came under increasing threat from banditry and piracy. In response, the British, followed by other nations, introduced a policy of gunboat diplomacy, running regular naval patrols along the river to protect their economic interests. While the first American gunboats appeared on the Yangtze just after the American Civil War, the U.S. Navy did not truly make its presence felt at China until the Boxer Rebellion of 1899 to 1901, a mass anti-colonial rebellion which was ultimately quelled by an alliance of 7 Western imperial powers and Japan. Thereafter, the U.S. Navy maintained a small fleet of gunboats called the Yangtze Patrol, which protected American expatriates during the 1911 Chinese Revolution, the warlord era of 1916 to 1927, and the re-establishment of the Republic of China in 1928. By the mid-1930s, the fleet numbered 6 vessels, designed as they were for use on shallow rivers against local bandits and pirates, with the Panay sporting a 3-inch quick-firing cannon on her bow and stern, as well as 8 30-caliber Lewis machine guns on her upper superstructure for defense against small boats and aircraft. By the mid-1930s, however, the situation in southern China had calmed down significantly, and while the nationalist government of Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek continued to fight the communist forces of Mao Zedong in the north, service on the Yangtze Patrol became a leisurely and highly coveted posting for U.S. sailors. With little in terms of action to deal with, life aboard a China River gunboat consisted largely of endless banquets and sports competitions with crews from other countries' gunboats, as well as keeping the ship clean and tidy to show the flag. Thankfully, much of the menial labor on board, from scrubbing the deck to cooking meals to laundering uniforms, was performed by a large contingent of local Chinese laborers. And while pay was low, it went far in China, meaning that sailors on shore leave were seldom short of cash to spend in the bars, theaters, and brothels of Shanghai. But this charmed life came to an abrupt end in 1937 with the outbreak of the Second Sino-Japanese War. The Empire of Japan had long had territorial ambitions in mainland Asia, and over the last 30 years had annexed an increasing amount of territory, including Taiwan and the Penghu Islands in 1895, parts of the East Coast in 1905, Korea in 1910, the former German colony of Tsingtao in 1914, and Manchuria in 1931. Then, following a skirmish between Chinese and Japanese forces at the Marco Polo Bridge near Peking on July 7, 1937, Japan launched a full-scale invasion of China, landing troops in Shanghai on August 13th. Though the Japanese expected a quick and easy victory, the Chinese defenders put up a fierce resistance, and the Battle of Shanghai dragged out into a 3-month house-to-house slogging match through the ruins of the city, inflicting over 18,000 casualties on the Japanese side. While Shanghai ultimately fell on November the 26th, these heavy losses shocked and demoralized the Japanese troops, who had been indoctrinated with notions of cultural and military superiority over the Chinese. It was a blow which was to have horrific consequences. Throughout the Battle of Shanghai, Japanese forces were careful to avoid damaging neutral ships and properties in the city's foreign-controlled international settlement, though accidents inevitably occurred. For example, on August the 20th, a stray Japanese shell struck the cruiser USS Augusta, which was the flagship of the U.S. Navy Asiatic Fleet, killing 1 sailor and wounding 18. This prompted a stern protest from Admiral Harry Yarnell, Commander-in-Chief of the fleet, who demanded that the Japanese reposition their ships, a request the Japanese duly granted. Yet in spite of these concessions, it soon became clear that the thousands of U.S. servicemen and civilians in China were in ever-growing danger of becoming caught in the crossfire. In an attempt to mitigate the risk, on August the 10th, U.S. Secretary of State Cordell Hull had issued a directive to the Yangtze River Patrol emphasizing that, to quote, U.S. forces in China are in no sense expeditionary forces. They are not in occupation of an enemy territory, nor are they defending territory of the United States. They are expected to protect lives, but they are not expected to hold positions regardless of hazards. They would be expected to repel threatened incursions of mobs or of disorganized or unauthorized soldiery, but they would not be expected to hold a position against armed forces of another country acting on express high authority. As a further measure, Hull also urged the Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs to instruct Japanese forces to refrain from attacks upon defenseless cities, hospitals, trains, and motor cars, etc. But Hull was pessimistic about the odds of avoiding collateral damage, later writing, "Sooner or later, some incident is going to happen resulting in the death or injury of American citizens going about their legitimate occupations within the interior of China where such dangers should not exist." Unfortunately, he was soon to be proven horribly correct. On December the 9th, Japanese forces reached the outer defensive line around Nanking and began mercilessly bombarding the city with artillery and ground attack aircraft. By this time, most of Nanking's American residents had already fled the city, with only a handful of embassy workers and journalists remaining behind. Then, on December the 11th, these stragglers finally abandoned their offices and boarded the Panay, bringing the ship's total complement to 5 officers, including Commander James Hughes and Executive Officer Lieutenant Arthur Anders, 54 enlisted men, 4 U.S. Embassy staff, including Senior Diplomatic Officer George Atchison, and 10 civilians. Among the civilians were 6 journalists: Norman Alley of Universal Newsreel, Eric Mayel of Movietone News, Norman Sung of the New York Times, Jim Marshall of Collier's Weekly, and Sandro Sandri and Luigi Barzini of the Italian newspapers La Stampa and Corriere della Sera. This brings us to the morning of December the 12th, 1937, when the Panay was moored 43 kilometers upstream of Nanking, along with 3 Standard Oil Company tankers, the Meiping, Meiyan, and the Meijia, preparing to lead the small civilian convoy downstream to Shanghai. Despite Panay's crew informing Japanese forces of their identity and mission and lashing large American flags onto the deck, Japanese artillery continued to target the flotilla, forcing them to move ever further upriver. Further, that morning, Panay received word that 4 British Insect-class gunboats, the HMS Ladybird, Bee, Cricket, and Scarab, had come under attack from Japanese aircraft, resulting in 1 sailor killed and 4 wounded. Meanwhile, Panay came once again under fire from the distant artillery and moved yet further upstream, where she was signaled by a Japanese army unit on the shore. Japanese soldiers then approached Panay in an armed motorboat and boarded her, demanding to know their purpose for being on the river and the disposition of Chinese forces in Nanking. Incensed, Commander Hughes curtly responded, "This is an American naval vessel. The United States is friendly to Japan and China alike. We do not give military information to either side." At this, the Japanese soldiers departed without incident. But if Hughes thought he and his crew were out of danger, he was to be proven spectacularly incorrect. For at around 1:30 that afternoon, the shapes of 3 aircraft appeared overhead, and as they began diving towards the Panay, Commander Hughes realized he was under attack. At less than 1,000 feet, the 3 Yokosuka B-4Y dive bombers released their 100 bombs, which came whistling down onto the Panay. One scored a direct hit on the pilot house, severely wounding Commander Hughes and knocking out the ship's steering, radio, sickbay, 3-inch guns, and electrical system. Now in command, Lieutenant Anders ordered the crew to return fire, as 6 more dive bombers came screaming down and 9 Nakajima A-4N fighters began strafing the ships. Sailors scrambled from their cabin to man the 8 Lewis guns on the upper deck. Among them was Chief Boatswain Mate Ernest Malman, who was in the shower when the bombs started falling and rushed onto the deck dressed only in a shirt. This incident appeared in newsreel footage shot by Universal Newsreel cameraman Norman Alley, immortalizing Malman as the pantsless gunner of the Panay. Lieutenant Anders also manned one of the guns, but was soon struck in the hands and throat by shrapnel from an exploding bomb. In total, 5 bombs struck the Panay in 30 minutes, and by 2 p.m. she had begun to list and take on water. The 3 Standard oil tankers had also been hit and were engulfed in a sea of flames. Unable to speak and with blood dripping from his throat, Lieutenant Anders scrawled out his orders on a nautical chart: abandon ship. The wounded, including Commander Hughes, were transferred to the Panay's motor launch and ferried ashore. It was a fraught evacuation, with the Japanese aircraft continuing to bomb the launch as it darted between the ship and the shore. But while the boat suffered numerous bullet holes and began taking on water, the crew did manage to evacuate the Panay with no further loss of life. Concealed in a patch of reeds in the riverbank, the survivors watched as a group of Japanese soldiers approached the Panay in a motorboat and boarded her, likely searching for codebooks and other intelligence. Finding nothing, they soon departed. 2 hours later, the USS Panay finally slipped beneath the muddy waters of the Yangtze. The attack on the Panay claimed 4 lives: storekeeper First Class Charles Ensminger, coxswain Edgar Holzbus, Standard Oil tanker captain Carl H. Carlson, and Italian journalist Sandro Sandri. An unknown number of Chinese sailors and refugees also perished aboard the 3 tankers. Of the 54 survivors from the Panay, 43 sailors and 5 civilians were wounded, 16 so severely that they could not move on their own. The group now faced a fateful choice: stay put and wait for rescue, or risk the 13-kilometer journey to the nearby Chinese-held village of Hoshin. Concluding that the Japanese were likely looking to execute anyone who had witnessed the attack, the group improvised stretches for the wounded and started off towards Hoshin. As for Norman Alley, fearing his precious newsreel footage would be confiscated and destroyed, he wrapped the film in a sack and buried it in the mud. And so it was, cold, wet, and exhausted, with no food, it took the survivors an entire day to reach the village, where a missionary relayed news of their arrival to Nelson T. Johnson, the American ambassador to China. Finally, on December the 14th, 1937, the survivors were rescued by the Panay's sister ship, the USS Oahu, and the British gunboats HMS Ladybird and Bee. Though the attack had been horrific, it paled in comparison to the fate that befell the residents and defenders of Nanking. On December the 13th, Japanese forces finally broke through the city's defenses. Enraged by their setbacks at the Battle of Shanghai, Japanese troops embarked on an orgy of brutality and depravity unparalleled in modern history, raping, torturing, and slaughtering an estimated 200,000 Chinese soldiers and civilians in a massacre today known as the Rape of Nanking. As for the United States, news of the Panay's sinking ignited a political firestorm, raising the specter of war with Japan. Recalling the explosion of the USS Maine, which had triggered the Spanish-American War, U.S. Ambassador to Japan Joseph Grew warned the Japanese, "We must not forget history. Neither the American government nor the American people had wanted war with Spain in 1898, but when the Maine was blown up, nothing could prevent war." But the mood in the United States was nowhere near as bloodthirsty. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, much of Congress and the American public had maintained a firm isolationist stance, not wishing to be drawn into another foreign conflict. By contrast, the State Department and the Navy had pursued a more internationalist agenda, pushing for greater involvement in foreign affairs. As a result of this infighting, U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt faced an enormous challenge in trying to negotiate this explosive crisis. Japanese officials, including Imperial Japanese Navy Commander Masatake Okomiya, who had led the dive bombers during the attack, maintained that the sinking was a tragic mistake and that the Japanese pilots had mistaken the Panay and its accompanying oil tankers as Chinese troop ships. However, several pieces of evidence contradicted this claim. The weather on December the 12th had been bright and clear, and Norman Alley's newsreel footage clearly showed Japanese aircraft attacking the Panay at near-deck height, making it highly improbable that the pilots had not seen the large American flags displayed on her decks. Nonetheless, the strong isolationist lobby within the American government made Roosevelt highly reluctant to go to war, and he ordered the 30 frames showing the low-level attacks cut from Alley's footage before it could be shown in movie theaters. Even Secretary Hull was forced to admit, America is in no position to send sufficient naval forces to Japanese and Chinese waters to require the Japanese to make the fullest amends and resume something of law-abiding course in the future. And so it was that after 2 weeks of tense negotiation and diplomacy, the Japanese government agreed to take full responsibility for the incident, though they continued to maintain that the attack had been unintentional. Vice Admiral Rokuzo Sugiyama, Chief of Staff of the Japanese forces in northern China, was assigned to present the official apology, which reached Washington on Christmas Eve of 1937. In addition, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Vice Minister of the Navy and later architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, relieved Rear Admiral Teizo Mitsunami, commanding officer of naval air forces in the Shanghai region, of command. Japan's Navy Minister also extended the apologies of every member of the Japanese Navy and announced that the Imperial Navy would render a salute to honor the victims of the Panay. 4 months later, in April of 1938, the Japanese paid an indemnity of $2,214,007.36 to the United States. The Panay crisis was officially over. Reflecting on the incident, Secretary Hull recalled, "On this side, our people generally took the incident calmly. There were a few demands that the fleet should be sent at once to the Orient. There were many more demands that we should withdraw completely from China. It was a serious incident, but unless we could have proven the complicity of the Japanese government itself, it was not an occasion for war." Today, it's generally agreed that the attack on the Panay was likely intentional, with historians pointing to decrypted Japanese Navy radio messages ordering the dive bombers to attack. These messages were not made public at the time, as they would have revealed the US's penetration of Japanese naval codes. What is less clear is who ordered the attack and why, with the leading theory being that it was carried out without government authorization by a radical faction of the Japanese military. But whether the attack was intended to test the US's resolve in supporting China or provoking an all-out war, we will likely never know. What is known is that the incident and the world's muted response to the Sino-Japanese War as a whole likely emboldened the Japanese to further pursue their territorial ambitions. The United States had thus not avoided war, but merely delayed it, a fact which would become abundantly clear when, nearly 4 years to the day after the Panay incident, swarms of Japanese planes appeared in the skies over Hawaii. And for more on why the Japanese chose to attack the US at Pearl Harbor, even though they knew they'd handily lose a war with the US, do go check out our recent video on our sister channel, Today I Found Out, Why Did the Japanese Join the Non-Aryan Hating Nazis?